She showed up to destroy the date. She didn't expect him to make her feel human again. Emily Carter walked into that coffee shop with one goal: make him leave. Worn-out sneakers, no makeup, dead eyes. She had rehearsed every way to be unlovable. What she hadn't prepared for was a man who didn't flinch, who just looked at her. Not through her. At her. Like she was still worth seeing. She didn't know his real name yet. Didn't know about the empire, the penthouse, the billions. All she knew was that for the first time in a year, someone made her forget, just for a moment, that her life had burned to the ground. Drop a comment with your city. Let's see how far this story travels. The alarm went off at 4:47 in the morning, 13 minutes before it was supposed to, because that was the kind of thing that happened to Emily Carter now. Small, stupid failures, relentless, patient, like they were taking turns. She lay there in the dark for a moment, staring at the water stain on the ceiling of her studio apartment, the one shaped vaguely like the state of Florida that she'd been meaning to report to the super since November. It was March now. She hadn't reported it. She'd stopped reporting things. The radiator knocked twice, then went quiet. Outside, a garbage truck groaned its way down West 83rd Street, and somewhere above her, whoever lived in 4C was already awake, pacing. They were always pacing. Emily used to wonder what kept them up. Now she understood completely. She sat up and reached for her phone out of habit, then stopped herself before she could check the banking app. That was a morning rule she'd made after the third time she'd started the day by reading the number $2,847.19 and feeling it settle into her chest like a stone. Some mornings you needed 20 minutes before you let reality back in. She got up instead, put her feet on the cold floor, made it count. The apartment was small enough that 3 steps got her to the kitchen, which was generous calling it a kitchen. A 2-burner stove, a half fridge that rattled when the compressor kicked on, and a window that faced the brick wall of the building next door. She'd hung a small photograph of the Brooklyn Bridge there once, taped to the glass, so she'd have something to look at while the coffee brewed. It had faded to almost nothing in the winter light. She'd stopped seeing it months ago. Emily Carter was 30 years old, and she had gotten very, very good at not seeing things. She poured yesterday's cold coffee into a mug and put it in the microwave and stood there watching the seconds count down. And she thought about the day ahead. There was a job in Astoria, a small one, pulling up water-damaged subfloor in an old brownstone somebody was converting into rental units. The owner was a nervous little man named Gerald, who paid in cash every Friday and expected her to pretend she didn't notice when he skimmed $20 from what they'd agreed on. She noticed. She always noticed. She just needed the money more than she needed to say so. The microwave beeped. She drank her lukewarm coffee standing at the window, looking at the brick wall, and she thought briefly about the version of herself that had existed 18 months ago. That Emily had an office with a view of the Hudson, a drafting table covered in blueprints and color swatches and hand-drawn sketches of restored cornices and original molding. She had a fiancé who brought her coffee from the good place on Lexington, the one with the handwritten menu. She had a 5-year business plan and a client list that was finally growing past referrals. She had genuinely believed, that she was building something real. She put the mug down before she finished thinking about it. That was another rule. But then, the coffee shop she went to every morning before jobs was called Halcyon, which she had always found slightly ironic given that she went there specifically to sit with her unhappiness in peace. It was 2 blocks from her apartment, sandwiched between a dry cleaner and a shuttered pizza place. And it had exactly 7 small tables, exposed brick, and a rotating selection of folk music that nobody ever complained about. The owner, a 50-ish woman named Rosa with silver-streaked hair, and the unhurried manner of someone who had already survived everything, had stopped asking Emily what she wanted when she walked in. She just started the oat milk latte and put a bran muffin on a small plate without being asked. Emily loved her for it. She never said so. She came in that morning at 5:23, before the commuters and the laptop workers and the new mothers with strollers, and she took her usual table in the back corner, and she opened her sketchbook to a blank page, and she sat there without drawing anything. This was her ritual. Not the drawing, the sitting, the having of a place that was slightly hers, even if she was only borrowing it, the warmth of it. The ordinary sounds of milk being steamed and music she barely heard, and Rosa reorganizing the pastry case with methodical calm. She'd been coming here since October, 3 days after she'd moved into the studio, and 2 days after she'd admitted to herself that she wasn't going to bounce back from Marcus as quickly as she'd told her friends she would. Marcus. She turned to a fresh page in the sketchbook and drew a door instead. She was good at doors, all the detail work, the grain of wood, the shape of hardware, the light coming through a transom window. She could spend an hour on a door and not think about anything else. She was halfway through shading the threshold when her phone buzzed. Jess. You up? Jess. I know you're up. You're always up. Jess, call me. Emily looked at the messages for a moment. Jess Nakamura had been her best friend since their second year of architecture school at Columbia. Back when Emily still wanted to be an architect and Jess had already pivoted to interior design and was already building the relentless networking machine that would eventually turn her into one of the most sought-after residential designers in the city. They were complete opposites in almost every way, which was probably why it worked. Jess operated at a frequency most people found exhausting. Emily had always found it grounding. She typed back, "It's 5:30. Jess, I'm aware. It's important. Jess, are you at that sad little coffee shop? Emily looked around Halcyon with its warm lights and Rosa's hand-painted chalkboard menu and the small shelf of community books near the door. She thought sad was harsh. Emily, it's not sad, Jess. It has 7 tables, Emily. Jess, anyway, Friday night, dinner. I'm setting you up. Emily put the phone face down on the table. She picked it up again. Emily, no, Jess, yes. Emily, absolutely not. Jess, you haven't been on a date in 14 months. Emily, I've been busy, Jess. You've been hiding. There's a difference. Emily stared at the screen. The problem with Jess was that she was almost always right, and she delivered being right without any of the gentleness you might hope for from a best friend. There was no padding, no softening, just the thing itself, handed to you like a bill. Emily, who is he? Jess, someone I know through a client. He's normal, he's smart, he's not horrible looking. You'll like him, Emily. You've said that before, Jess. Ryan was a mistake and I acknowledged that. This is different, Emily. How, Jess? Because I actually met this one in person. He's real. Just come. One dinner. If you hate it, I'll never bring it up again. Emily looked at the door she'd been drawing. She had added a small crack in the frame without meaning to. Emily, fine, but I'm not dressing up, Jess. Oh my God, you're such a nightmare, Jess. Be there at 7. It's the Italian place on Bleecker I sent you last month, Jess. And Emily? Jess, please wear something that doesn't have paint on it. Emily put the phone in her bag and went back to the door in her sketchbook. She filled in the crack, made it a shadow instead, and by the time Rosa brought over a second latte she hadn't ordered but apparently needed, she had almost convinced herself that Friday was still 4 days away, and she didn't have to think about it yet. The brownstone in Astoria was a disaster in the best possible way. Emily loved buildings like this, structures that had been neglected just long enough to reveal everything underneath the surface improvements. Pull up the carpet and find original oak hardwood. Chip away the drywall and find the bones of what the original builders had intended back when people still put craft into the walls. There was an honesty to a building in this condition that she'd stopped being able to find in people. Gerald, the owner, met her at the door in a fleece vest and reading glasses pushed up on his forehead, looking mildly panicked. He had that look often. It was his resting expression. The plumber says the subfloor extends under the bathroom too, he said, by way of greeting. I was hoping it was just the kitchen. It's always more than you think it is, Emily said. She set her bag down in the front hallway and looked around with the practiced eyes she'd developed over the last year of doing this work. Not the eyes she'd trained in school. That was the eye for potential, for vision, for what something could become. This was a different eye. Practical. Diagnostic. It looked for what was broken and how bad. Can you do both? Gerald asked. Give me until noon to assess the bathroom, and I'll tell you what I can do and what you need to bring in a licensed contractor for. She paused. And Gerald, we should talk about the rate for the additional scope before I start. Gerald blinked at her like this was an unexpected and slightly rude thing to say. Of course, he said quickly. Absolutely, yes. She went to work. This was the part of her life that made sense. Not the money. The money was tight enough that she had to plan grocery trips around what was on sale, and not the prestige because there wasn't any. But the work itself, the physical problem solving of it, the way a building told you what it needed if you paid attention, this she understood. She had fallen into renovation work sideways, out of necessity, after the company folded. She'd always had the technical knowledge from school and from the years she'd spent in the field before starting her own practice, but she'd never done the physical labor directly. Now she did. She pulled floors and patched plaster and stripped old paint and rehung doors that had warped out of their frames over decades. She worked with a small crew sometimes and alone other times, and she was good at it in a way that surprised her at first, and then stopped surprising her because it turned out she'd always been good at the thing underneath the thing she thought she was good at. She'd just never needed to find that out before. By noon, she'd pulled up 6 feet of water-damaged subfloor in the kitchen and confirmed the bathroom was in worse shape than Gerald had hoped. She explained what needed a licensed contractor and what she could handle, and she quoted him a fair rate for the rest, and she was direct about the timeline. Gerald agreed with the enthusiasm of a man who was grateful someone was making his decisions for him. She drove home in her van, a 2009 Ford Transit with a cracked passenger mirror and a collection of toll receipts in the cup holder. And she stopped at the grocery store and she bought what was on sale. And she went home and made pasta and sat on her secondhand couch. And she did not watch television because television required choosing something, and most evenings choosing felt like too much. She opened her laptop instead and spent an hour reviewing the project that had been occupying the back of her mind for months. The Hollander Building. It was a 6-story mixed-use structure in Brooklyn Heights, built in 1923, currently owned by a small property management company that was doing the bare minimum to keep it habitable. Emily had walked past it 100 times. She'd gone inside once, on the pretense of inquiring about a commercial rental on the ground floor, just to see the lobby. The original terrazzo floors, the pressed tin ceilings, the wrought iron stair railings that someone had painted over in institutional beige sometime in the 1980s. It had almost made her cry, not because it was ruined, but because it wasn't. Underneath the neglect and the bad decisions, it was all still there. She had a complete renovation proposal saved in a folder she never opened. She'd built it over 4 months, in the hours before sunrise at Halcyon and in the evenings when she couldn't sleep, because it was the closest she could get to doing the work she actually wanted to be doing without the resources or the connections to make it real. She looked at it for a while and then she closed the laptop and went to bed. She lay awake for 45 minutes thinking about Friday. Jess called her on Thursday evening while Emily was recaulking her bathroom tub, which was a job she'd been putting off for 2 months and had chosen to tackle specifically because phone calls were harder to deflect when your hands were occupied. "I need you to listen to me," Jess said, without preamble. "I'm busy." "You're caulking something. How do you know that?" "Because you only answer the phone when you're doing a task that requires both hands, and you're too polite to say you can't talk." "What is it?" Emily looked at the tube of caulk in her hand. "I hate you. You love me. Listen, he might be a little quiet at first. He's not a flashy person. Don't let that put you off." "Why are you telling me this now? You said he was normal." "He's normal. He's just composed. Like, he has this very steady thing about him. Some people read that as cold, but it's not cold. It's just—" "Jess, he lost his wife a few years ago," Jess said. The sentence came out more careful than Jess's sentences usually did. "He's been raising his daughter alone. He's been through something real. I want you to keep that in mind." Emily set the caulk down on the edge of the tub. "A widower." "Yes, with a kid, 6 years old, Lily. She's apparently wonderful. I haven't met her, but Jess, why didn't you tell me this when you first asked me?" "Because I knew you'd say no." Emily opened her mouth and then closed it again, because that was probably true. "His name is Nate," Jess continued. "He works in investments. He's 32. He specifically asked me to keep things low-key, which I respected, so I haven't told him much about you either, except that you're an architect, and you're brilliant, and you've had a rough year." "You told him I've had a rough year?" "I told him you've had a rough year, so he'd have realistic expectations, yes. You can thank me later. I'm going to hang up on you. Wear the blue dress, the dark one." "I don't have a blue dress anymore." There was a pause. "What happened to the blue dress?" "I packed it when I moved, and then I unpacked everything else, and it didn't seem—" Emily stopped. "It just didn't seem like a blue dress kind of year." The line was quiet for a moment, And Jess, who did not do quiet easily, let it be quiet. That was the thing about her. Underneath all the forward momentum, she knew when to stop. Wear whatever you want, she said finally. Just come, okay? That's all I'm asking. Friday came the way Fridays do when you're dreading them, faster than any other day of the week, barely pausing to let you prepare. Emily stood in front of her small closet for 6 minutes at 5:45 in the evening and looked at her clothes with the impartial gaze she usually reserved for assessing damaged plaster. She owned 2 pairs of jeans, 1 pair of work pants, 3 sweaters of varying warmth, a collection of flannel shirts she'd started buying when she realized flannel was both functional and socially acceptable as outerwear, and 1 black blazer that she'd bought 2 years ago for a client presentation and worn exactly twice. She put on the dark jeans, a gray sweater that was clean and soft and had no paint on it, the black blazer, her worn leather ankle boots. She looked in the bathroom mirror for a moment, long enough to note the circles under her eyes, the hair that needed a trim, the general air of someone who had been surviving something. And then she deliberately did not spend any more time on it. This was strategic. She understood that. She was going to this dinner, she was going to fulfill the obligation to Jess, and she was going to make it as short and painless as possible. Not by being rude, she didn't want to be rude to a man who had apparently suffered real loss, but by being exactly herself. Tired, unpolished, emotionally unavailable in a way she couldn't disguise even if she wanted to. She was doing him a favor, she told herself. What kind of man in his right mind would look at her right now and think there's someone worth pursuing? She took the subway to Bleecker instead of a cab, because the cab would have cost $12 she didn't particularly want to spend, and she stood in the crowded car gripping the overhead bar and watching the dark tunnel through the smudged window, and she thought about what she'd say to get out of this gracefully. She could claim an early job tomorrow. She could be generically pleasant and uninteresting. She could answer every question with the polite minimum. She was good at the minimum lately. She had been practicing. The restaurant was called Morandi, warm and candlelit and full of the specific low murmur of a Friday evening in the West Village. Emily arrived 3 minutes late, which was intentional. She stood in the doorway for a moment, scanning the room, and found herself looking at a man sitting alone near the window. He wasn't what she'd expected. She'd expected someone polished, someone who looked like what Jess's clients looked like, curated, expensive in a quiet way, practiced at making a good impression. She'd expected effort. Instead, she saw a man in a dark navy sweater and simple trousers, no tie, sitting with both hands wrapped around a water glass as if he'd arrived early and used the time to get still rather than to perform. He had dark hair going slightly gray at the temples. He was broad-shouldered in a way that wasn't aggressive, just present. He was looking out the window at the street with an expression that wasn't impatient, just private. Like he was thinking about something that had nothing to do with the restaurant. On his right wrist, she noticed, he was wearing what looked like a child's bracelet. Small plastic beads, pastel colors, the kind a 6-year-old might make on a rainy afternoon and present with complete sincerity. He hadn't taken it off for a date. That was the first thing she registered about him. Not the gray at his temples, not the way he looked, not whether he was attractive or not. The bracelet. She walked to the table. He looked up when she reached him, and he stood, not with the theatrical courtesy of a man performing manners, but the automatic standing of someone who had been taught to be decent and done it for long enough that it was reflex. He was taller than she'd realized from across the room. "Emily," he said, "that's me." She sat down before he could hold her chair, partly because she wasn't sure she wanted that yet, and partly because she was already a little off balance and physical gestures of that kind had a way of making her feel things she wasn't prepared to feel. He sat back down, and there was a moment, about 4 seconds, where neither of them said anything, and where some people would have rushed to fill it, and some people would have been uncomfortable, and he was neither. He just let it be 4 seconds. "Jess says you work in investments," Emily said, because she needed to start somewhere. "I do." A brief pause. "She says you restore buildings." "Renovation work mostly, smaller projects right now." She left it at that. He nodded. The waiter came and asked about drinks, and Emily ordered sparkling water, and he did the same, which surprised her slightly, and the waiter left and they were back in the quiet. "She also told me," he said, "that you've had a rough year. I hope that wasn't a violation of trust. She seemed to think it was useful information. Emily looked at him directly for the first time. He had gray eyes, not a poetic gray, just actual gray, like concrete on a cloudy day. And he was looking at her with an expression that was honest in a way she didn't know how to categorize immediately. Not sympathy, not that tilted head, soft-eyed thing people did when they felt sorry for you. More like recognition. She told me you lost your wife, Emily said. Not to be blunt, but because it seemed like they were doing this, being direct, skipping some of the usual scaffolding. Something crossed his face. Not pain exactly, or not new pain, more like the adjustment a person makes when a familiar weight shifts. 3 years ago, he said. Her name was Caroline. I'm sorry. Thank you. The words were simple, and he meant them simply. Emily picked up the menu. What's good here? Do you know this place? I've been once. The pasta was good, straightforward. They don't overcomplicate things. He glanced at his own menu. I appreciate that in a restaurant. Me too, she said, and meant it. Notes. The thing about the dinner was that it didn't go the way she'd planned. She had gone in intending to be pleasant and minimal, to fulfill the obligation, to give Jess enough to report back that it hadn't been a disaster while making it clear, gently, without cruelty, that this was a one-time thing. But Nate, he said, though something in the way he said it suggested it wasn't the whole name, just the version he offered to people at first, was not easy to be minimal with. Not because he demanded more. He didn't demand anything. It was more that he was so genuinely himself, without any apparent interest in performing or impressing, that Emily's carefully maintained distance kept slipping when she wasn't paying attention. At one point, she'd started explaining the Hollander building. Not meaning to, she'd been answering a question about what kind of work she most wanted to do, and it had come out before she'd thought about whether to share it. And she'd talked for almost 8 minutes straight about the terrazzo floors and the pressed tin ceiling and the wrought iron railings painted over in institutional beige. And when she finally caught herself and stopped, she expected the polite nod and the redirect that most people gave when someone had gone on longer than the conversational contract allowed. Instead, he said, "Tell me about the railings. What year do you think the beige paint happened?" She looked at him. 1982 or 3, based on the color palette and the coverage pattern. Someone did the whole lobby in one weekend. You can tell by the drips. How do you remove it without damaging the underlying metal? Chemical stripping first, then hand tools for the detailed work. It's slow. You can't rush it, or you lose the surface finish underneath. But it's still there, he said. The original finish. That's the thing about buildings, Emily said. People do a lot of damage, but they rarely actually destroy what's underneath. It's still there. It's just covered. He looked at her with that concrete-colored gaze and didn't say anything for a moment, and Emily had the odd sensation that they had not been talking about buildings for at least part of that exchange. She picked up her water glass and looked away. What about you? She said. What's the work you actually want to do, as opposed to the work you do? He was quiet for a moment, not avoiding the question but considering it seriously, which she'd already noticed was his way. There are communities in this city that have been not abandoned, exactly. Overlooked. Spaces that used to matter to people that have been let go. I've thought for a long time about what it would mean to invest in those, not just financially. He turned the water glass in his hands. Buildings tell you what a community used to value. Sometimes they're the only thing left that does. Emily looked at him. That's exactly what I think, she said, before she could consider whether to say it. He smiled for the first time since she'd arrived. It was a small smile, not performing anything, and it changed his face in a way she hadn't anticipated. Made him look younger, and underneath the composure, not as armored as she'd assumed. She looked down at her pasta and reminded herself why she'd come tonight and what she'd planned to do about it. She was not doing it very well. They stayed until the restaurant was half empty, which was almost 2.5 hours. Toward the end, she mentioned that she'd studied architecture at Columbia. He asked what had made her choose that, and she talked about a building she'd seen as a child, a small post office in the Connecticut town where she'd grown up. Nothing famous, just a WPA-era building with clean stone and a wooden counter worn smooth by 80 years of hands. She'd been 7 years old, and she'd stood in the lobby and looked up at the ceiling and thought, someone cared about this place before I was born. She'd never been able to explain why that had mattered so much to her. He listened without interrupting. That was something she noticed people rarely did anymore. Listen without the slight forward lean that meant they were waiting for their turn. "What made you go into investments?" she asked. He paused, and something was careful in the pause. Not evasive, but careful. "It was where I could have the most impact," he said, "at the scale I wanted to work at." Emily registered the slight vagueness of it. She didn't push. When they finally got up to leave and the waiter brought the check, she reached for her half automatically. This was not a date, she had decided. It was a dinner, and she paid her half of dinners. But he had already set his card down with the quiet efficiency of a person who had done this many times and had no intention of making it a negotiation. "You didn't have to do that," she said. "I know." Simple, without the expectation of credit for it. They walked out into the West Village night, and it was cold, the kind of early spring cold that still has real winter in it, and Emily pulled her blazer tighter, and they stood on the sidewalk for a moment in the comfortable way of two people who had talked longer than expected and weren't entirely sure how to end it. "I have a job in Red Hook at 7 tomorrow," she said. "Early night for me." "Of course." He wasn't going to make it awkward. She had known somehow that he wouldn't. She started and stopped, because what she'd been about to say this was actually okay, and she didn't know if that was appropriate, and also she wasn't certain it covered what she actually meant. "It was good to meet you, Emily," he said, and the straightforwardness of it was such a relief that she felt something crack open slightly in her chest, just at the edges. "You too," she said. "Nate." She went down into the subway. She stood in the car going uptown, and she held the overhead bar and she didn't look at her phone. She looked at the dark tunnel going past the window and she thought, against every effort not to, about small plastic beads on a man's wrist, about wrought iron railings still whole under a coat of beige paint, about the specific quality of someone who listened without waiting. She got home and sat on her second-hand couch. She did not convince herself it had been nothing. 3 days later, Jess called at a reasonable hour. "So," she said. "Don't," Emily said. "How was it?" "It was fine." "Fine like terrible, or fine like fine, Jess. We had dinner. It was a nice dinner." "He texted me," Jess said, without any pretense of building to it. "He asked if you'd be open to getting coffee sometime. He wanted to ask through me because he didn't want to put you on the spot if you weren't interested." Emily set down her sketchbook. She'd been at Halcyon, which had been a tactical error because there was nowhere to walk away to. "He asked through you," she said. "He said, and I'm quoting here, that he didn't want to presume, that it was a nice evening and he understood if it wasn't what you were looking for, but that he thought he'd like to see you again." Emily stared at the blank page in her sketchbook. "He said presume?" she said. "I told you he was composed." "That's not composed, that's—" She stopped, because the word she'd been about to use was considerate, and she wasn't prepared to say that out loud. "Emily." "What?" "You liked him." The terrible thing about Jess was that she was almost never wrong. Emily picked up her pencil and drew the first line of a door. "Tell him coffee is fine," she said. "Saturday morning. Somewhere in Brooklyn. I have a job in Carroll Gardens after." Jess made a sound that Emily refused to categorize as a squeal. "And Jess, keep the commentary minimal." "Absolutely," Jess said, in the tone of someone who had never done anything minimally in her life. Emily drew the door. She added a transom window. She spent a long time on the glass. The coffee shop they met at on Saturday was in Cobble Hill, a neighborhood Emily knew well enough to feel comfortable in, small and warm in the way of places that have been on the same corner long enough to belong to the neighborhood rather than the other way around. Nate was already there when she arrived. He'd ordered her an oat milk latte without asking, and for a moment she was annoyed. She could order her own coffee. And then she realized Jess must have told him, and the annoyance softened into something she was less sure how to categorize. "I hope that's right," he said, nodding at the cup. Jess was very specific. Of course she was. Emily sat down. She's probably prepared a dossier. "She did actually mention that you're allergic to cilantro, you prefer window seats, and you worked a 14-hour day last Wednesday. The cilantro's genuinely dangerous. The rest is surveillance." He smiled. That same small smile from the restaurant, the one that did the thing to his face. He was wearing a gray sweater this time, a different one, but the same quality of simple, and the bracelet was still there on his wrist. She found herself looking at it and making herself look away. "How was the Red Hook job?" he asked. She'd mentioned it only in passing, at the end of a 2-hour dinner, on their way out the door. She hadn't expected him to remember it. Complicated, she said. The subfloor damage extended further than the owner estimated. Also, the original builder in 1987 made some creative decisions about load-bearing walls that I needed to flag. That sounds like a problem. It's manageable. I like complicated. Straightforward jobs don't give you much to work with. He turned his coffee cup in his hands. She was starting to recognize this as something he did when he was thinking. What's the most complicated job you've worked on? And she was off again before she could stop herself, talking about the Carroll Gardens apartment she'd worked on 6 months earlier, the one where they'd opened a wall expecting pipes and found the original 1890s wallpaper underneath. Pressed flower pattern in faded ochre and blue, perfectly preserved under a century of plaster. She'd spent 4 hours just documenting it before she touched anything. The owner had wanted to tear it out. Emily had spent 2 hours convincing him to preserve a section of it behind glass as part of the renovation. He still sends me photos of it, she said. People come to look at it. Just this small panel of wallpaper in a residential hallway in Carroll Gardens. But it was there. It had been there for 100 years, waiting for someone to... She stopped herself. Sorry. I do this. Do what? Monologue about buildings. I've noticed. He didn't say it unkindly. It doesn't bother me. Most people's eyes glaze over around the 3rd minute. I don't think most people have given it the thought you have. He looked at her directly. What happened to your practice? Just mentioned you had your own firm. And here it was. The question she'd been waiting for and not wanting, the one where she'd planned to give the minimum. It didn't work out. Things change. I'm focusing on project work right now and move on. She looked at him. He was watching her with that concrete gray gaze, honest, not probing, not performing sympathy, just present with the question. My fiancé, she said, my former fiancé. He was also my business partner. She kept her voice even because she'd had 14 months to practice making it even. He had been sleeping with a client for about 8 months before I found out. When I found out, I also found out he'd been funneling firm expenses through her project invoices, which meant that when things fell apart personally, they fell apart professionally at the same time, and I was the one holding the liability because my name was the one on the business license. The quiet that followed was the right kind of quiet. Not the horrified pause before condolences, not the awkward silence before someone said something inadequate. Just a moment where he let what she'd said have the weight it actually had. I'm sorry, he said finally. That's a real and significant loss. Not how terrible or what a horrible person, or you'll bounce back, you're so talented. Just, that is a real and significant loss. Emily looked down at her coffee cup. Something behind her eyes felt dangerous, and she blinked once firmly and looked back up. It is what it is, she said, which was the phrase she used when she needed to move on from something. It doesn't have to be only that, he said gently, without any pressure behind it. She looked at him for a long moment. How do you do that? She said. Say the exact right thing without making it into a thing? He looked slightly caught off guard, which was the first time she'd seen him look that way. I don't know, he said honestly. I've had practice, I suppose, learning what doesn't help. She thought about what Jess had told her on the phone Thursday. He lost his wife. He's been raising his daughter alone. Lily, Emily said. Does she know you're here? Something changed in his expression. Opened in a way, became less careful. She does. She gave me instructions. He glanced at the bracelet on his wrist, almost involuntarily. She said I was supposed to be funny because funny people have more friends. Emily laughed, an actual laugh, surprised out of her before she could make it appropriate, the kind that you didn't mean to let out. She covered her mouth with one hand and he looked at her with an expression that was so unexpectedly soft that she had to look away again. How did you do? She asked, when she could. Debatable, he said, and the corner of his mouth moved. They stayed for another hour, sat. Emily walked to her job in Carroll Gardens afterward through the cold March air, her coat buttoned to her throat and her hands in her pockets, and she thought about the conversation with the same careful attention she gave to a building she was trying to understand, cataloging what she'd found, assessing the structure underneath. He was not what she'd planned for. He was not the man she'd braced herself against. He was, and she turned this thought over slowly, the way you turned over a piece of reclaimed wood to look at the grain. He was real in a way that was harder to dismiss than she'd expected. Not perfect. She could see the places he kept things close. The slight reserve when she'd asked about his work. The careful way he handled certain questions. He was not an open book, but what he offered honestly, without ornamentation or strategy. She'd known people her whole life who offered more and meant less. She stopped at the corner of Kane and Court, where the coffee shop was still visible a block behind her, and she stood in the cold for a moment and she thought about wallpaper behind plaster, about things still there underneath the damage. She was afraid. She wanted to be clear with herself about that. The fear was real and specific, not abstract romantic anxiety, but the earned, calibrated fear of a person who had lost something they'd believed in completely and not yet stopped paying for it. But Nate hadn't asked her to stop being afraid. He'd just shown up for coffee and remembered she was allergic to cilantro and told her that her losses were real and let his daughter's bracelet stay on his wrist in public. She turned her collar up and walked toward Carroll Gardens, and she thought that maybe, carefully, without commitment, without any guarantees, she would see what came next. Just the next thing. Nothing more than that. Not yet. The Carroll Gardens job ran long, the way complicated jobs always did when you were honest about them. Emily spent most of that Saturday afternoon on her knees in a gutted bathroom, pulling damaged lath from a wall cavity, while the owner, a retired school teacher named Donna, who hovered nearby with cups of tea Emily didn't have time to drink, talked about her late husband and the way he'd loved this apartment and why she couldn't bring herself to sell it even though 3 flights of stairs were getting harder every year. Emily listened while she worked, which was something she'd gotten good at. People talked when you were in their homes doing physical labor. Something about the act of taking a place apart made them want to explain why it mattered. She drove home with plaster dust in her hair and a detailed list of what the Donna job would need next week. And she sat in the van outside her building for a few minutes before going in, engine off, listening to the street settle into its Saturday evening sounds. She was tired in the clean way, the way that came from actual physical work, and she was thinking about the coffee shop in Cobble Hill, which she'd been trying not to think about since she'd left it 4 hours ago. She'd given Jess a 1-sentence report that evening. It was good. Stop asking. Jess, predictably, had responded with 7 follow-up questions. Emily had answered 2 of them. What she hadn't told Jess was that she'd laughed, a real laugh, the involuntary kind that came out before you could shape it into something more controlled. She hadn't done that in a long time. She hadn't realized she'd stopped until it happened again, and the feeling of it was slightly foreign, like finding a coat in the back of a closet you'd forgotten you owned. She went upstairs and showered and ate leftover rice and stared at her sketchbook without opening it, and at 9:15 her phone buzzed with a text from a number she hadn't yet saved. "This is Nate. I wanted to make sure this got to you before the week started. Lily informed me this evening that I should have asked for your number directly instead of going through Jess. She said, and I'm quoting, 'That's just more professional, Dad. She's 6. Emily read it twice. Then she typed, "She's not wrong." A pause. Then, "No, she really isn't. She usually isn't," which is humbling. Emily saved the number. She put the phone down and picked it up again and typed, "Tell her the coffee was good. She can take partial credit for the instructions." Another pause, longer this time, and she imagined him showing Lily the phone and explaining what partial credit meant, and the image of it landed somewhere soft and unguarded in her chest before she had time to close the door on it. She says she accepts. She also wants to know if you like pancakes. Emily stared at that for a moment. Why? She makes them on Sunday mornings. She is, apparently, recruiting. The laugh came again, quieter this time, just a breath of one, and Emily pressed her lips together and typed, "Tell her I'm extremely fond of pancakes," and put the phone face down on the couch cushion because she needed to not read whatever came back for at least 5 minutes. She lasted 3. Sunday, 10 a.m. We're in the West Village. I'll send the address. Only if you want to. Absolutely no pressure either way. She thought about it. She thought about it longer than she should have needed to, turning it over, looking at it from the side the way she looked at structural problems. The thing was, she could feel the want clearly enough that it scared her. She'd trained herself over the past 14 months to distrust wanting things. Wanting things led to trusting things, and she'd watched her own trust get used as a tool against her with the patience and precision of someone who had been planning it for months. But there was a 6-year-old who made pancakes and had opinions about professional conduct, and there was a man who wore her bracelet on his wrist to dinner with a stranger. And Emily was tired. Not just the clean physical tired from today, but the deeper kind. The kind that came from keeping everything at a careful distance for so long that the distance had started to feel like the whole landscape. "Sunday at 10 works," she typed. "I'll bring the orange juice. It's the least I can do since she's cooking." She put the phone down again. She went to bed. She did not sleep for a while, but it was a different kind of awake than usual. Less like lying under weight, more like sitting with something uncertain, but not yet bad. She'd take it. No, the address he sent was on a tree-lined block in the West Village, one of those streets that Manhattan keeps hidden between the ones everyone knows. And Emily stood in front of the building on Sunday morning with 2 containers of orange juice from the grocery store and had her first real look at the place where Nathaniel Hayes lived. It was a pre-war townhouse, 5 stories, limestone facade, the kind of building that had been on this block since before the neighborhood had its current name. She noticed before she meant to. The original ironwork on the entry steps, the lintel detail above the door, the window proportions that gave away the era. Late 1920s, she thought. Good bones. Very good bones. She was not going to think about the market value of a 5-story West Village townhouse. She was not going to do that math. She pressed the buzzer. The voice that came through the intercom was not Nate's. It was small and clear and slightly breathless, like someone who had been running. "Is it the orange juice lady?" Emily blinked. "Yes?" "Dad." "She's here, and she brought it." The buzzer sounded, the door clicked, and Emily pushed it open into a vestibule with original black and white hexagonal tile on the floor, which she noticed and then firmly told herself was not the point of the visit. Nate appeared at the top of a short interior staircase, slightly rumpled in a way she hadn't seen him before. Jeans, a flannel shirt with the sleeves pushed up, bare feet, hair that hadn't been organized yet into anything deliberate. He looked more like himself, she thought, and then wasn't sure why she thought that, since she'd only met him twice. "Good morning," he said. "I apologize in advance for whatever is about to happen." Before Emily could ask what that meant, a small figure came barreling around him and stopped at the top of the stairs, studying her with the frank appraisal that only very young children and very honest adults could pull off without it being rude. Lily Hayes was 6 years old, brown-haired, brown-eyed, and wearing an apron that said "Chef" in block letters that was approximately 3 sizes too large for her. She had maple syrup on her left cheek. She was looking at Emily with the focused intensity of someone conducting a serious evaluation. "You have paint on your jacket," Lily said. Emily looked down. There was, in fact, a small streak of dried white paint near the cuff of her jacket that she'd missed. "I do," she agreed. "Good eye." Lily nodded, apparently satisfied. "Dad has paint on his shirt sometimes, too. He says it adds character." "He's right." "Come see the pancakes," Lily said, and turned and disappeared back into the apartment with the confidence of someone who had issued an invitation and fully expected it to be accepted. Emily looked at Nate. He had an expression on his face that she couldn't quite name, something between apologetic and something else, something more open. "She's been up since 6:30 preparing," he said. "I can tell," Emily said, and went up the stairs. The kitchen was at the back of the apartment, and the apartment itself was... She processed it in parts the way you had to, because the whole thing at once was a lot. High ceilings with original molding, built-in bookshelves on both sides of the living room fireplace, full to the edges. A Persian rug on wide plank floors that had been refinished but not replaced. The furniture was good, well made, lived in, not staged. A child's drawing was taped to the refrigerator with 4 magnets. A pair of small sneakers were next to the kitchen door, one upright, one on its side. It was a home, an actual one, not a showroom. She'd been in enough apartments in the city to know the difference. The kitchen was warm and smelled like butter and batter, and the first good thing of the morning, and Lily was standing on a step stool at the counter, tending a griddle with the gravity of someone performing open-heart surgery. The technique needed work. She was flipping too early and pressing down with the spatula, which Emily knew from experience would make them dense. But the commitment was immaculate. "How do you like yours?" Lily asked, without looking up from the griddle. I'm flexible, Emily said. Lily looked up briefly. Are you allergic to anything? Jess's friend Janet is allergic to eggs, but she still comes to breakfast and just eats the fruit, and I think that must be really sad. I'm not allergic to eggs. I'm allergic to cilantro, but that doesn't usually come up in pancakes. It doesn't, Lily confirmed. I asked Dad about that. He looked it up. Emily set the orange juice containers on the counter and looked at Nate, who was pouring coffee with the focused expression of a man pretending he hadn't looked up cilantro in pancakes. Thorough, Emily said to him. She asked, he said simply. They ate at the kitchen table, which was round and slightly too small for comfortable adult conversation, but the exact right size for a 6-year-old to dominate, which Lily did with the natural authority of someone who had grown up as the center of her father's world. The pancakes were slightly dense, but genuinely good, and Emily told Lily so directly, without the exaggerated enthusiasm adults sometimes offered children, and Lily received the honest assessment with a pleased nod that suggested she had expected nothing less. Emily fixes buildings, Lily told her pancakes, then looked up at Emily. Dad told me. I do. Do you fix them when they're broken or before they're broken? Usually after, Emily said. When they've been broken for a while, actually. I like the ones that have been left alone too long. They have more to show you. Lily considered this with the serious face she seemed to bring to most information. Like the Velveteen Rabbit, she said. Emily paused. Yes, actually, like that. Nate across the table was looking at his coffee. Emily had the sense he was being careful about his expression. Lily loves that book, he said to the coffee. Dad cried the last time he read it, Lily said matter-of-factly. I did not cry. Dad. Lily looked at him with enormous patience. I was right there. My eyes were tired. Dad. Okay, he said. I may have felt the themes deeply. Emily laughed, and it was easier this time than the last. And even easier than that felt like something she probably needed to pay attention to. The morning opened up like that, unhurried, unplanned. After breakfast, Lily wanted to show Emily her room, which was decorated with a chaotic mix of drawings pinned to every available surface, a bookshelf organized by color rather than author, and a collection of small plastic animals arranged on the windowsill in what Lily explained was family groups, but I decide the families, not what kind of animal they are. The giraffe is in the same family as the small blue hippo, Lily explained, pointing, because they both like the window side. Makes sense to me, Emily said. Lily looked at her with a measuring expression. You're easy to explain things to, she said. Some grown-ups make a face like they're just waiting for you to stop. Emily sat down on the edge of Lily's bed, having been gestured to by Lily with the authority of a host, and she thought about that. I know that face, she said. I've gotten it a lot. That's rude, Lily said. Yeah, Emily agreed. It kind of is. Lily picked up the giraffe from the windowsill and handed it to Emily with the ceremony of someone presenting an award. You can hold Gerald, she said. Emily looked at the small plastic giraffe. Gerald, she said. He's shy, but he likes new people once he knows them. Emily looked up and found Nate leaning in the doorway of Lily's room, watching them with his hands in his pockets and an expression on his face that was completely unguarded in a way she hadn't seen before. Not the composed, careful face from the restaurant or even the easier version from this morning. Something that looked like it had gotten past his usual architecture and not been able to get back in. He caught her looking and straightened slightly, and the expression settled back into something more guarded, but not fast enough. She looked down at the small plastic giraffe in her hand. She stayed for 3 hours. She thought about that look for the rest of Sunday and all of Monday and most of Tuesday morning while she was replastering a section of cracked wall in a Prospect Heights kitchen, spreading compound with the long, flat pull that required the right amount of pressure and almost none of her conscious attention, which left the rest of her mind free to do what it had been doing since the West Village. She was falling for him. She knew it the way you knew a structural issue before you'd fully diagnosed it, the evidence accumulating quietly until one morning you couldn't pretend you hadn't been seeing it. The way he handled Lily, not with performance or with the slightly self-conscious parenting of someone who knew they were being watched, but with the plain attention of a person who had built his actual life around this child. The way he listened, which had not been an accident or a first date technique, but apparently just how he was. The fact that he had looked her up a cilantro allergy not to impress her, but because his daughter had asked. The look in the doorway. She was also afraid in a way that was getting harder to manage with the tools she'd been using for the past 14 months, because those tools had been designed for a different kind of distance than this. She'd gotten good at keeping the world out when it knocked. This felt less like knocking and more like someone standing quietly nearby until she remembered the door opened from the inside too. She spread another section of compound and thought about Marcus. She did this less often now than she used to. It had become less like an open wound and more like scar tissue, present but not active. But she made herself do it deliberately sometimes, the way you tested a healed bone to know how much weight it could bear. Marcus had been charming in a way she'd mistaken for depth. He'd been attentive in a way she'd mistaken for care. She had been, she understood now, genuinely good at not seeing things that she didn't want to see, and he had known that, had counted on it. The thing she kept turning over was this. She was not seeing anything innate that required willful blindness. She was not excusing things or rationalizing gaps or talking herself into anything. If anything, she'd been actively looking for reasons to be cautious and finding them in short supply. He was not perfect. He had the reserve, the careful vagueness about his work, the places he kept close, but these did not feel like the managed concealment of someone running a con. They felt like the closed rooms of a person who'd been hurt and hadn't yet decided whether to show you the whole house. She understood that. She was living in mostly closed rooms herself. She cleaned her tools and packed up and drove home and found 2 texts from Nate from the afternoon. One asking if she knew anything about the Baxter building in Red Hook, which a colleague had mentioned to him, and one a few minutes later that just said, "Never mind, I found the reference. Completely understand the appeal now." Someone really did paint over original mahogany trim with latex white, didn't they? She stared at the second message for a moment. He'd gone and looked it up on his own. He'd gotten interested. "Latex white over mahogany," she typed back. "In 1994. I have crime scene photos. I would like to see them." "You say that now," she wrote, "but I get emotional about it, and it takes about 40 minutes. "I have time," he wrote back simply. She sat with her phone in her hand in her van outside her building, and she thought that this was how it happened, wasn't it? Not in a moment, not in a gesture, just in the accumulation of small, honest things until you looked up and realized you were somewhere different than where you'd started. She went inside and found the photos. Moktum. They developed a rhythm over the next 2 weeks that neither of them had formally agreed to, but both of them had apparently decided on. Coffee on Saturday mornings, sometimes Carroll Gardens, sometimes Cobble Hill, once a place in Dumbo she'd been meaning to try and had never had a reason to. Texts throughout the week that started as specific questions about buildings, about Lily's ongoing animal family taxonomy, about a book one of them had mentioned and the other had gone and found, and gradually became less structured than that, less transactional, more like the kind of low-frequency conversation you had with someone who was becoming a consistent presence in your interior life. She met him outside a bookshop in the West Village on a Thursday evening by accident. She'd been heading to a hardware store 2 blocks over, and he'd been walking home from a meeting, and they'd both stopped when they saw each other with the slight recalibration of people encountering each other outside their usual coordinates. He was in a suit jacket, which she hadn't seen before, though he'd loosened the tie and the jacket was slightly rumpled in the way of someone who'd had a long day and been too busy to notice. "Long one?" she said. He looked down at himself. "Is it obvious?" "Only the jacket. The rest of you is fine." He looked at her with brief, unguarded pleasure at that, and then gestured at the bookshop. "Were you going in?" "Hardware store," she said. "You?" "I was." He paused. "Do you want to come in instead?" "I was looking for something for Lily. She's decided she wants to learn about bridges." Emily stared at him. "Bridges? Specifically, how they don't fall down. She's been worried about it since we walked across the Brooklyn Bridge last weekend." "How old is she again?" 6.5, he said. She just started saying the half like it matters. "It matters," Emily said firmly. 6.5 is meaningfully different from 6. He looked at her, and the warm, unguarded thing was back in his face. "Come help me find a book about bridges," he said. "Please." So they went in, and Emily spent 45 minutes in the children's section of a West Village bookshop with a man she was falling for, finding him a book about bridges for a 6-year-old who had architectural anxiety. And it was the most comfortable she'd felt inside a building in a long time, which was saying something. She found a book, a well-illustrated one that explained load distribution in terms a child could follow, which she'd come across years ago and recommended to a colleague's kid. And she handed it to him and explained why it was the right choice in terms that were probably more detailed than required. He was listening with his whole attention. She kept talking. The owner of the shop, a small older man in a cardigan, came past once and gave them the look he probably gave everyone who stayed too long. They ignored him. "Does she have favorites yet?" Emily asked. "Bridges, I mean." "The Brooklyn Bridge," he said. "Obviously, but she's been drawing the others. She said the Williamsburg Bridge is scrappier, like it's trying harder." Emily stopped. "She said that?" "Last Tuesday." That's actually exactly right," Emily said. "The Williamsburg is scrappier. It's a utilitarian design. It doesn't have the Brooklyn's showmanship, but there's something honest about it that—" She caught herself. "Sorry." "Don't apologize," he said, in the tone he used for things he meant simply. They paid for the book. He paid. She didn't fight it this time. And they stood outside on the sidewalk in the evening cold, and there was a moment that was different from previous moments, weighted in a way that hadn't been there before. He was close enough that she could see the slight tiredness around his eyes from the long day, and the bracelet at his wrist where his sleeve had pushed back. And he was looking at her with something careful and also something past careful. "I should get home," he said. "Lily's with my neighbor until 7. "Of course," Emily said. He didn't move immediately. "Emily," she looked at him. "I want to tell you—" He stopped, started again. "I'm not sure how to do this correctly." "Do what?" "Say that I'd like this to be something, without making you feel—" He paused, and she could see him choosing the words with a care that was entirely characteristic of him. "Without making you feel like there's something you owe." She held his gaze. The cold was settling around them, and the street was doing its evening thing, people moving past with groceries and strollers, and the low urgency of getting somewhere, and Emily stood in the middle of it and thought about open doors and wallpaper under plaster and bones of things still intact after everything that had been laid over them. "I know I'm not the easiest situation," he continued when she didn't say anything. "I come with complications, and I know you've been through something real, and I don't want to be something that makes that harder." "You're not making it harder," she said. He was very still, waiting. "You're actually making it considerably less awful," she said, "which is the most I was hoping for from any of this, when I came to that dinner 4 weeks ago planning to be as unlovable as possible." Something shifted in his face. "You were planning to be unlovable?" "Extensively." "I thought you seemed tired," he said, "and honest, and like someone who had stopped pretending to be fine when she wasn't." Emily looked at him. "That was supposed to repel you." "I know," he said. "It didn't." She exhaled. "Nate." "Yes." "I need you to know that I'm scared. That's real. I'm not going to perform bravery about it." "I know," he said again. "I'm not asking you to." A pause. Traffic went past. A cyclist rang a bell at a pedestrian and someone shouted something in response, and the ordinary noise of the city did its ordinary thing and left them in the middle of it. "Tell Lily the book is the right one," Emily said. "She'll want to look at chapter 4 first. It has the best diagrams." He nodded, and the look on his face was the one from the doorway of Lily's room, the unguarded one, the one that had gotten past his usual architecture. And this time he didn't have a chance to put it away before she'd seen all of it. She went to the hardware store. She didn't remember afterward what she'd gone to buy. On a Saturday in early April, they took Lily to Brooklyn Heights, walking the promenade and then down into the neighborhood where Emily knew the buildings the way she knew most things she cared about. From the ground up, details first, the history of each block as a story rather than a timeline. Lily walked between them, holding her father's hand on one side and occasionally reaching for Emily's on the other in the distracted, confident way of a child who assumed the adults around her would accommodate without being asked. Emily let her hand be taken without making anything of it, and was aware as she did so of Nate noticing and choosing not to comment, which was exactly right. They stopped in front of a brownstone on Remsen Street that Emily had always loved. 1880s, Romanesque revival, original sandstone that had gone the warm amber color of old wood, the arched windows with their carved keystones still intact. That one, Lily said, pointing with her free hand. That's a good one. How do you know? Emily asked. Lily squinted at it with her father's considering expression, which was disconcerting in a 6.5-year-old. It looks like it's been a lot of things, she said. But it stayed. Emily looked at the building. She thought about what Lily had said for a moment. The pure, accidental accuracy of it. You're going to be terrifying when you're grown up, she told Lily. Lily nodded, satisfied. I know, she said, and walked ahead of them on the sidewalk, looking at buildings. Nate came up beside Emily, and they walked together in the space Lily had left between them, and his hand brushed hers once, briefly, without pressure, a question more than a statement. And Emily turned her palm, and he took it, and they walked like that the rest of the way down Remsen Street without saying anything about it at all. It looked like it's been a lot of things, Emily thought, but it stayed. She held on. 3 weeks later, on a Thursday evening that started like all the others, everything broke open. She was at her desk. Not the coffee shop desk, the small table in her studio where she worked on estimates and proposals, under the good lamp she'd bought as a treat to herself when she landed the Carroll Gardens job, when Jess called in the specific pattern of 2 calls within 30 seconds that meant it wasn't optional. Okay, don't, Jess started. Don't what? Emily said, already sitting up straight. Just before you react. I need you to know I genuinely did not know when I set you up, or I would have... Jess, do you have the internet open? Can you look something up? What? Search Nathaniel Hayes, Jess said, and her voice was doing the thing it did when she was worried. Nathaniel Hayes, CEO. Investment, just a pause. Just look. Emily typed the name into the search bar with the calm of someone who had not yet understood what was coming. She hit enter. The results loaded. She stared at the screen. The first result was a Forbes profile, then a Bloomberg article, then a Wall Street Journal interview, then a photograph. Nathaniel Hayes, her Nate, in a suit she recognized as more expensive than she'd processed at the time, standing in front of a building that she now understood was not just his office, but his building, his name on it, his company's name on it. One of the largest private investment firms in the country, founded when he was 26 years old, and now worth a figure that Emily read twice because the first time she thought she'd misread it. She had not misread it. She sat very still at her small table under her good lamp for a long moment. Emily, Jess said quietly. I know, Emily said. I really didn't. I know, Jess. Her voice was very even. She'd had practice with very even. She closed the laptop. She sat in her apartment in the dark, and she thought about the townhouse on the West Village, tree-lined street with its pre-war limestone and its wide plank floors and its bookshelves, and the child's drawing on the refrigerator. And she thought about the careful vagueness when she'd asked about his work. And she thought about the way he'd said investment manager the first time she'd asked, and she'd taken it at face value because there had been nothing in his manner that suggested deception. She'd thought he was keeping closed rooms because he'd been hurt. She hadn't thought about what those rooms contained. The radiator knocked on. She didn't move. After a long time, she picked up her phone and looked at the last text he'd sent her. From that afternoon, a photograph of Lily's latest bridge drawing. The Williamsburg this time, crayon, very detailed for 6.5, with a small figure standing at the center that Lily had labeled Emily in careful letters. She put the phone face down on the table. She sat with it for a very long time, and then she called him. He answered on the second ring. Emily, why didn't you tell me, she said. No preamble, no building to it. Silence. 3 seconds. 4. I was going to, he said. When? Another pause, and she could hear him moving, a door closing, the particular quiet of a person who has stepped away to have a conversation they knew was coming and had been both dreading and knowing they deserved. I don't have a good answer to that, he said. Try anyway. He was quiet for a moment that felt like him deciding how to be honest. When I meet people, women specifically, people who know who I am, it changes things before there's anything real to change. I've watched it happen enough times that I stopped wanting to watch it happen. And then you showed up to that dinner clearly hoping I'd leave in the first 10 minutes. And you talked about buildings with your whole self. And you asked for nothing. And Lily, he stopped. Lily liked you before I did. And she's never wrong. And I kept waiting for the right time, and then the right time started feeling impossible because there was already... He stopped again. There was already something. Emily pressed her fingers to her eyes. Nate, I know. You let me think. I know. I told you about Marcus, she said, and her voice did something on the word that she couldn't entirely control. I told you what he did. I told you what it cost me. And then you... I know. His voice was very low. I know what I did. And I'm not going to tell you it's not the same, because you get to decide that, not me. The silence that followed was the worst kind. Not empty, but full of things that didn't have the right shape yet. I need to think, she said. Okay. I'm not saying... She stopped. I just need to think. Emily... His voice was quiet and careful, and underneath that, something she wasn't prepared to hear yet. I'm sorry. That's not sufficient. I understand that. But I'm sorry. She ended the call. She sat at her small table under her good lamp in her studio apartment with its Florida-shaped water stain and its rattling refrigerator and its brick wall outside the window, and she thought about what it meant to be someone who was good at not seeing things they didn't want to see. She had thought she was so much better at it than she used to be. Turned out she hadn't been seeing this either. Just the other direction, looking for the crack in the foundation and missing the whole structure it was built on. She picked up the phone and looked at Lily's drawing again. The small crayon figure labeled Emily standing in the middle of the Williamsburg Bridge, between the towers. She put the phone down. She went to bed and stared at the ceiling and did not sleep and said nothing to it. She didn't go to Halcyon the next morning. This was the first sign that something in her had shifted past manageable, because Halcyon was where she went when things were bad. It had been her reset point for 7 months, the place where the day started before it could go wrong, where Rosa knew her order and the folk music was low, and the 7 tables meant the world was small enough to sit inside without it pressing in. She had gone there the morning after she'd found out about Marcus. She had gone there the morning she'd gotten the certified letter from the liability attorney. She had gone there on the days when the work dried up, and the studio apartment felt like a box she'd locked herself inside. She did not go there on Friday morning. She drove straight to Astoria instead, to a plumbing-adjacent subfloor issue that Gerald had flagged on Thursday and that she'd agreed to look at on Saturday, but now needed to look at on Friday, because she needed to be somewhere that required her body and none of her mind. Gerald was surprised to see her at 7:15. He said so, in the way Gerald said most things, which was with the faint alarm of someone who found all departures from schedule faintly alarming. I moved some things around, Emily said, and went past him into the brownstone. She worked for 5 hours without stopping except to drink from the water bottle she kept in her bag. She pulled damaged subfloor boards, assessed the joists underneath, made a materials list, patched a section of the subfloor in the bathroom that was reachable without additional demo. The work required just enough attention to make thinking about anything else an active choice rather than a passive drift, and she was grateful for that. Her hands knew what to do. Her body moved through the familiar sequence of assess, plan, execute, and the rest of her got quiet. Gerald brought her a sandwich at noon that she hadn't asked for and ate half of in the van before driving home, which was probably the most nourishment she'd had since Thursday evening, and she registered this without doing anything differently about it. She had 3 texts from Nate, spread across the morning. The first said, I want to explain properly, if you're willing to hear it. Not to fix it, just so you have the whole picture. The second, 2 hours later. I'm not going to push. I just wanted you to know the door is open when you're ready. The third was sent at 11:43 and was shorter. Lily asked about you this morning. I told her you were busy. I didn't know what else to say. She read all 3 sitting in the parking spot outside her building, engine off, rain starting against the windshield in the light, insistent way of early spring rain that couldn't decide whether to commit. She read them twice. Then she put the phone in her bag and went upstairs and took a shower and ate the other half of the sandwich and sat on her couch. She thought about what he'd said on the phone. You showed up to that dinner clearly hoping I'd leave in the first 10 minutes, and you talked about buildings with your whole self, and you asked for nothing. She turned that over. She understood it. Not as justification, but as a real human thing. The fear that the truth of what you were would change how someone saw you before they'd had the chance to see you at all. She understood it specifically. In the way you understood something that matched a shape you already carried. That was the problem. She understood it too well to dismiss it cleanly, and the parts of her that were still raw from Marcus kept trying to collapse the two things into the same shape, and they weren't. She knew they weren't, but knowing and feeling were running on separate tracks right now, and she was too tired to bridge them. She opened her laptop and pulled up the Hollander building proposal. Not to work on it, just to look at something she'd built carefully and methodically and not lost yet. She fell asleep on the couch at 9:30 with the laptop open on the coffee table and the rain still going against the window. She called Jess on Saturday. Jess picked up before the first ring finished, which meant she'd been waiting. "Okay," she said. "I know you didn't know," Emily said. "I want to be clear about that. I genuinely did not. When he came to me about the setup, I had met him once through a client event, and I knew he worked in finance, and he'd been widowed, and he had a young kid, and he seemed decent. I did not know the full scope of what finance meant in his case." "Did your client know?" A pause. "My client knows who he is, yes. She didn't tell me because I hadn't asked." Emily absorbed this. It was the nature of Nate's world. She was beginning to understand. People who knew, people adjacent to people who knew, and a very careful radius of ordinary life he'd constructed around himself and Lily that existed at a different altitude from the rest of it. He'd chosen Jess because Jess didn't move in those circles directly. He'd chosen a restaurant in the West Village instead of the places someone at his level would actually frequent. He'd shown up in a navy sweater instead of anything that signaled what he was. It had been deliberate. Every part of it had been deliberate. She didn't know yet if that made it worse or just more complicated. "What are you going to do?" Jess asked. "I don't know." "Do you want me to tell you what I think?" "No," Emily said. "Okay." Another pause. "Do you want me to tell you anyway?" Despite everything, Emily felt the edge of something almost like a laugh. "You're going to whether I say yes or not. Only because you need it," Jess said. "I think what he did was wrong. He should have told you earlier. Definitely before the first walk in Brooklyn Heights. Definitely before Lily handed you a plastic giraffe and named it Gerald. Those were moments where the concealment shifted from protection to deception, and he should have seen that line, and he didn't." She stopped. "But I also think he's not Marcus." "I know he's not Marcus. Do you?" "Because from where I'm standing, you've been operating for the last 14 months with a very specific internal alarm system, and it goes off on a hair trigger now, and I think right now it's going off so loud you can't hear the difference." Emily pressed two fingers to her temple. That's reductive. "I'm not saying your feelings aren't valid. I'm saying be careful about which feelings you're leading with." "Jess." "I'm done," Jess said. "That's all I had. The rest is yours." Emily looked at her wall. The photograph of the Brooklyn Bridge she'd taped to the kitchen window had finally given up and slipped off its tape in the night, and she could see the street-level brick wall of the building opposite clearly now. She'd stopped really seeing the photograph months ago anyway, but the wall was just a wall. "He texted 3 times this morning," Emily said. "I know. He texted me too. He wanted to know if you were okay. She stopped. "He texted you to ask if I was okay? He's not asking me to intervene. He just wanted to know you were all right." Emily sat with that for a moment. Marcus had never once, not in 3 years together, thought to check whether she was okay through a third party after a fight. He'd been the kind of person who went cold in disagreements, who made the silence stretch until you came to him, who had never once in their entire relationship been the one to extend first. She knew they weren't the same person. She'd known that from the first dinner. "I'll call you later," she said to Jess. "Emily?" "I know. Give it a few days," Jess said, more gently now. "You don't have to decide anything today." She gave it 4 days. They were not easy days. She worked, Gerald's job, a small consultation in Park Slope she'd been putting off, an evening spent at the Hollander Building's block, just walking around it in the cold, looking at it from different angles the way she sometimes needed to do before she knew what she thought. She didn't text Nate, and he didn't push. True to his word, though she found herself checking for messages she hadn't received with the frequency of someone who couldn't decide what they actually wanted the answer to be. On the fourth day, she went to Halcyon. Rosa put the latte down and looked at her with the attentiveness of someone who had been watching Emily Carter come through her door for 7 months and could read the register of her face like a building she knew well. "Long week," Rosa said. It wasn't a question. "Yeah." Emily wrapped both hands around the cup. "Man trouble?" Emily looked up. Rosa shrugged one shoulder. "You've had a lot of kinds of bad weeks. I know what this one looks like." She turned back to the pastry case without any further comment, leaving the observation to stand on its own. Emily opened her sketchbook. She drew a door, then stopped, and turned to a blank page and wrote instead, "What do I actually know?" It was the question she used for buildings when she was trying to get past the assumption layer to the actual structural evidence. Strip out everything she'd inferred or feared or overlaid from previous experience. What were the actual facts in front of her? She wrote for 20 minutes. It was not a flattering list for her own reasoning process. She had assigned Marcus's pattern to Nate based on a single category of overlap, hidden information, without adequately accounting for the difference in kind and the difference in evidence of intent. She had been so carefully watching for the early signs of being used that she had perhaps not been adequately watching what was actually happening in front of her. What was actually happening in front of her was a man who had lost his wife and spent 3 years making sure his daughter still had a full life, who had agreed to a blind date set by a mutual acquaintance and been honest about who he was in every way that wasn't directly about his net worth, who had listened without performing and asked questions he actually wanted the answers to, and put his daughter's plastic bead bracelet on before a date and left it there, who had, when she'd pushed him away, sent 3 careful texts and 1 message through a third party asking if she was okay, and then stopped and waited. She closed the sketchbook. She thought about what Jess had said. "He's not Marcus." She thought about what Nate had said the night she'd called him. "I'm not going to tell you it's not the same because you get to decide that, not me." He had not defended himself by minimizing her response. He had handed the judgment back to her and stood in the discomfort of it without managing his way out. That was not what Marcus did. That was the opposite of what Marcus did. She picked up her phone and texted, "I want to hear the explanation, not to fix anything yet, just to hear it." His response came within 2 minutes, which told her something about how his mornings had been going. Name the time and place. "I'll be there." Quote, they met at a coffee shop in Dumbo that neither of them had a prior claim to, which felt right, neutral territory, no associations. It was a Tuesday morning, the 3rd week of April, and the East River was visible through the tall windows, gunmetal and choppy in the wind. Emily was there first. She chose a table near the window and ordered coffee and sat with her hands around it and waited. He came in looking like he hadn't been sleeping cleanly, which was the first honest thing about his appearance in a while, or the first time she'd seen the evidence of it. He'd shaved, but his eyes had the particular quality of eyes that had been doing too much in the dark hours. He sat down across from her and didn't start with anything ambient. "Thank you for coming," he said. "You don't need to thank me," she said. He ordered coffee from the passing server and looked at the table for a moment, organizing something. Then he looked at her directly, which was characteristic of him. He didn't approach difficult things sideways. "When Caroline died," he said, "I was 30. Lily was 3. I spent the first year just—" He paused. "Surviving the administrative reality of grief, which is vicious in ways nobody prepares you for. The paperwork, the decisions, taking care of a 3-year-old while you're not taking care of yourself. The business kept running because I had good people, but I was not—" Another pause. "I was present in the technical sense." Emily didn't say anything. She let him have the shape of it. "The second year I started trying to have a life again," he said. "Tried dating, twice, seriously enough to matter. Both times I told them who I was up front, because I thought that was the right thing, the honest thing." He turned his coffee cup in his hands, and she recognized the gesture, the thinking through his hands thing. Both times the relationship changed from that moment. Not dramatically, not obviously, but changed. The way I was seen shifted, and I was not— He stopped. "I was a widower with a toddler trying to figure out how to be a functional person again, and suddenly I was also a financial asset that required management. Both of them were good people, I think, but the knowledge of what I was worth did something to how they held me. Emily was quiet, watching him. So I stopped doing it that way, he said. I decided that anyone worth knowing would know me first and the rest of it second. That seemed reasonable in theory. He looked up at her. Then Jess asked me about the setup, and I said yes because I'd been alone in a way that had started to feel like a permanent condition, and she seemed to think you were real, and then you came to that dinner trying to be invisible and talked about buildings like they were the most important thing in the world. And I thought, he exhaled, I thought, I need more time, just a little more time where she's seeing me. Emily absorbed this. And then Lily, she said. Something in his face moved. Lily doesn't like most people, he said simply. She's polite. She's not unkind, but she doesn't open up quickly. He stopped. She handed you Gerald on the first visit. She's never done that. Gerald doesn't leave the windowsill. Emily thought about the small plastic giraffe, the one who was shy but liked new people once he knew them. I kept telling myself I'd tell you soon, Nate said, but soon kept moving. And the longer I waited, the worse it got. But I couldn't. He pressed his fingers briefly to his eyes. I couldn't see a way to say it that didn't sound like exactly what it was. A man who had lied by omission for weeks to someone who had specifically told him what deception had cost her. The silence that followed was substantial. Outside, the East River moved under the wind. Do you understand, Emily said carefully, why it hit the way it did? Yes, he said without hesitation. Not just because you hit it, because of the specific thing you hid and the specific thing I told you and the timing of those two things relative to each other. Yes, he said again. I understand completely. I had all the relevant information about what this would mean to you, and I kept choosing my own comfort over giving you the truth. That's what I did. I'm not going to reframe that. Emily looked at him. She thought about what it would have taken Marcus to sit here and say those words in that specific order, without softening them, without the qualifying, but that followed every apology she'd ever received from him. She thought about it and found she couldn't get there, couldn't construct the version of Marcus who would have done this. I believe you, she said, that you were scared, that it wasn't malicious. He looked at her steadily, waiting for the rest. I also don't know how to just fold this into the previous story, she said. I don't know how to do that immediately, or maybe at all. I don't know yet. I know, he said. I'm not asking you to. Nate, she leaned forward slightly. What do you want from this conversation? Not what you think I need to hear. What do you actually want? He was quiet for a moment, and she could see him deciding to answer honestly, even though the honest answer was riskier than a measured one. I want you to give me the chance to be who you thought I was, he said, which is, I think, actually who I am. The money is real, but it's not the majority of what I am. Lily is the majority of what I am. The work I actually care about is the work you understood before you knew the scale of it. And He stopped, and for the first time in any conversation she'd had with him, he looked genuinely uncertain, less like a composed person and more like someone who had been braced for a long time and was tired. I haven't felt like a real person to someone in a long time, he said, and you made me feel like a real person. That's what I want back, if it's possible. Emily held his gaze for a long moment. I need time, she said. Okay. Not forever. Just time. Take what you need, he said. I mean that without any edge to it. She nodded. They finished their coffee. They didn't solve anything, and the walk out to the street was quiet in the careful way of two people who have said real things and are letting them settle before deciding what to do with them. He went north, she went south, and she walked 3 blocks along the waterfront with the wind in her face and the city doing its city thing, and she let herself feel the full, complicated weight of it, the anger that was still there, the understanding that sat alongside it, and underneath both of those, patient and inconvenient, the feeling that she'd identified weeks ago in her van outside her building and not been able to put down since. She wasn't done with him. She didn't know what that meant yet, but she wasn't done. She threw herself into the Brooklyn bookstore job the way she'd thrown herself into every piece of difficult physical work over the past year, which was completely and with a borderline self-punishing consistency that she was at least self-aware enough to recognize, even if she wasn't ready to do anything differently about it. The bookstore was on Atlantic Avenue in Boerum Hill, a long, narrow ground floor space that had most recently been a travel agency, and before that, for 30 years, an actual functioning used bookstore that had closed when the owner died and left the space to his nephew, who had neither the interest nor the knowledge to continue it, and had eventually decided to restore the space for commercial rental and hired Emily through a recommendation from the Carroll Gardens job. The nephew was a decent man named Patrick, mid-40s, who showed up once a week to check progress and brought good coffee and stayed out of the work, which was exactly what Emily needed from a client. The space had bones, real ones, 12-foot ceilings, original pressed tin that had been concealed under a drop ceiling installed sometime in the 1970s, wide plank floors under industrial carpet, a storefront window that had been partially bricked over and wanted to be reopened. Emily had pulled the drop ceiling herself on the first day and stood there looking up at the tin and felt, for the first time in weeks, the specific satisfaction of revealing something that should never have been covered. She worked 6 days that week, long days that started before Patrick arrived and sometimes ended after dark. Her crew was small, a carpenter named Danny who worked efficiently and without drama, and a day laborer she'd used before named Arturo, who was good with the floor, refinishing, and better company than most people she knew. They played a rotating playlist that was mostly Danny's and worked in the comfortable near silence of people with a common task. She didn't think about Nate while she worked. She thought about him on the drive over and on the drive home, and in the evenings in her apartment, and in the middle of the night when she woke up at 3 and couldn't get back down. But during the hours in the bookstore, her mind stayed in the room with her hands. On Wednesday of the second week, Jess stopped by. She appeared in the doorway at noon, in her work clothes, good coat, clean boots, the careful put-togetherness she carried everywhere, and looked around the space with the appraising eye of someone who dealt in interiors for a living. Her gaze went to the pressed tin ceiling, and her expression shifted from professional to genuine. "Oh," she said. "Right?" Emily said from the top of the ladder where she was cleaning a section of tin with a soft cloth. "How much of it is intact?" "Full run, front to back. Whoever installed that drop ceiling in '73 actually protected it better than if they'd left it exposed." She climbed down. "There's a section near the back that needs patching, but the pattern's documented enough that I can match it." Jess stood in the middle of the room looking at the ceiling for a moment, her head back, and then she looked at Emily with an expression that was complicated in the way Jess's expressions got when she was feeling something she wasn't going to announce directly. "He's been to the office twice this week," she said. Emily started cleaning her hands on a rag. "Okay. Not to ask about you. He's commissioning a project, the thing he told you about, investing in overlooked community spaces. He wants a designer involved from the beginning. He came to me." She paused. "I want you to know that because I don't want anything to feel like manipulation. He didn't mention you when he came in." Emily turned to look at her. "He didn't? He said he'd heard my name from a colleague and that he had a project he thought might be a fit for my work." That was it. Jess met her eyes. "He's doing the thing he told you he wanted to do. I thought you should know." Emily set the rag down. She thought about what he'd told her in that Dumbo coffee shop, carefully and without performance. "The work I actually care about is the work you understood before you knew the scale of it." She'd believed him when he said it. She still believed him. "Are you going to take the project?" Emily asked. "I don't know yet. I wanted to tell you first." Jess's voice was even, not pushing. "It's a real project, Emily, not a gesture. He's got a board, a timeline, actual capital committed. Someone with that kind of intention—" She stopped. "I'll leave the rest of that sentence alone." Emily looked at the ceiling. The tin pattern was a repeating Greek keyboarder with a floral center, and somebody in 1922 had put it up there with the intention that it would last, which it had, under 7 decades of suspended ceiling tile and bad lighting and a long series of tenants who never knew it was there. "He came to you professionally," Emily said. "Separate from me." "Yes." Emily picked up the rag again and went back to the ladder. "Take the project," she said. "It's good work. You should do good work when it's in front of you." Jess watched her for a moment. "Emily." "I know, Jess. You don't have to—" "I know." She climbed back up to the ceiling. "I'm not ready yet, that's all. I'm just not quite ready." Jess looked at her for another moment, and then she nodded the way she nodded when she understood, and didn't have anything more useful to add, which was the best thing about her. "The ceiling is extraordinary," Jess said, on her way out. "It really is," Emily agreed. 10 days after the Dumbo coffee shop, on a Saturday morning that was overcast but not raining, Emily was eating toast in her apartment when her phone showed an unfamiliar number. She let it ring. She almost always let unknown numbers ring. Then it rang again immediately, which was the pattern that meant something was actually happening, and she answered. "Emily Carter?" The voice was a woman's, older, clear, measured, not unkind, but not soft. "Yes? My name is Eleanor Hayes. I'm Nathaniel's mother." A brief pause. "I'm in the city. I'd like to talk to you, if you're willing. Not on his behalf. He doesn't know I'm calling. On my own." Emily stood in her kitchen holding a piece of half-eaten toast and said nothing for a moment. "I know this is unconventional," the woman continued without any apparent discomfort at Emily's silence. "I'm not asking you to come to us. I thought perhaps somewhere you'd feel comfortable. How did you get my number?" "Jess Nakamura. She wasn't sure she should give it to me. I told her I'd spent the last 3 years watching my son disappear into his work and his grief and his very careful management of everything around him, and that the last few months he'd seemed different, lighter." A pause. "She gave me the number." Emily put the toast down. She thought about the woman on the other end of this call, the mother of someone she was not done with. She thought about what it took to make this call, the calculation of it, the decision to step into the space between her son and someone he'd hurt. "There's a coffee shop on Atlantic Avenue," Emily said, "near my job site. I can be there in 45 minutes. "I'll find it," Eleanor Hayes said. Eleanor Hayes was 71 years old, well-dressed without being formal about it, silver-haired, and had her son's gray eyes and none of his reserve, or rather she had her own kind of reserve. The reserve of someone who had decided what she thought and chose carefully when to share it, rather than the reserve of someone still deciding. She was already seated when Emily arrived, with tea and an expression that assessed Emily the way Emily assessed buildings, taking the whole of it in before making judgments. "Thank you for coming," she said. "You didn't give me much to go on," Emily said, sitting down. "I don't know what this conversation is." "Neither do I entirely," Eleanor said, with a frankness that was immediately disarming. "I'm not here to argue for my son. I'm not here to explain him better than he explained himself. He's better at explaining himself than most people give him credit for, when he chooses to be." She wrapped both hands around her teacup, which was the gesture of a woman who had learned some version of her son's thinking through the hands habit, or whose son had learned it from her. "I'm here because I want you to understand something that Nathaniel won't tell you himself, because he doesn't think he's entitled to." Emily was quiet. His wife, Caroline, was a good person, Eleanor said. "I want you to understand that before I say the rest of it. She loved him, and she loved Lily. But she had grown up in a family with money, and she understood wealth the way you understand your native language, automatically, without thinking about it, without seeing it as a thing separate from the rest of you." She paused. When Nathaniel's company became what it became, the life around them changed. She wanted a life that matched. The full weight of it, the social obligations, the entertaining, the position. Nathaniel understood it as her comfort language. He went along with it because he loved her. Eleanor's voice was level throughout, not dramatic. And it was the levelness of it that made Emily stay with it, stay in it, instead of backpedaling from the intimacy of the information. She hated the press of it, Eleanor said, more than she'd expected to. The scrutiny, the comparisons, the feeling of being a public object attached to a public man. She was proud of him, and she resented what the pride cost her, and those two things were at war in her for the last 2 years of her life, and she stopped for a brief moment. She never quite resolved it. Emily thought she understood where this was going, but she didn't say so. "Nathaniel blamed himself for her unhappiness," Eleanor said. "Not for her death. Her death was an illness, fast and without warning, and there was nothing to be done. But for the years before it, he believed that the life his work created had made her miserable, and he had not seen it clearly enough to make it better. He carried that." She looked at Emily directly. "He still carries it." The rain had started again outside, light against the cafe window. Emily looked at her coffee cup. "His greatest fear," Eleanor said, is not losing his company or his fortune or his reputation. It's losing another family. Not just the loss itself, that he could survive again, though barely. It's that he would be the reason for the losing, that his world would be the corrosive thing, the way he believes it was with Caroline. Emily looked up. So he hid it from you, Eleanor said. Not to deceive you, not to manage you. He hid it because the world he was hiding is the world he is most afraid of. She paused. That is still an explanation, not an excuse. I want to be clear about that. I'm not here to excuse him. I'm here because I think you deserve the full picture to make a fair decision, and he won't give it to you because he doesn't think he's earned the right to ask for the benefit of the doubt. Emily sat with this for a long moment. The rain against the glass, the low hum of the cafe. An old woman who had driven into the city on a Saturday to tell a stranger something her son wouldn't claim for himself. What do you want me to do with this? Emily asked, finally. Eleanor's expression shifted slightly, the way it would if she'd been asked a question she hadn't expected. Nothing in particular, she said. Make whatever decision is right for you. I just wanted you to have... She paused. The railing under the paint, she said. Emily stared at her. He told me what you do, Eleanor said, and the edges of her expression softened just barely. He's told me a considerable amount about you, actually. I believe the phrase he used was, she talks about buildings like they're the most important thing in the world, and I think she might be right. Emily pressed her lips together. She looked out the window at the wet street for a moment. You drove in from where? She asked. Westchester, Eleanor said. It took 40 minutes. Does Nathaniel know you did this? He does not. The older woman picked up her teacup. He would be profoundly unhappy about it if he found out. Are you going to tell him? Eleanor looked at her with the steady gray eyes that were her son's eyes in an older version of the same face. That depends on whether it was useful, she said. Emily looked at the woman across from her. She thought about all of it, the full picture of it, laid out in the accumulated evidence of 8 weeks. She thought about Lily's drawing of the Williamsburg Bridge, with the small crayon figure labeled Emily standing at the center between the towers. She thought about Gerald, the plastic giraffe, who was shy but liked new people once he knew them. She thought about holding a man's hand on Remsen Street without either of them saying anything about it. She thought about what Eleanor had said. The world he was hiding is the world he is most afraid of. She was afraid too. She had been afraid since before the first dinner, and the fear was real, and it was hers to carry. But she had been carrying it without looking at what it was actually attached to, and she was getting the sense, sitting in this cafe on a rainy Saturday with a woman who had driven 40 minutes because she thought it mattered, that it was time to look. It was useful, Emily said. Eleanor Hayes set down her tea and nodded once, not satisfied, not triumphant, just present with the fact of it. He's a good man, she said, not a perfect one. I want to be very clear about that because I've met perfect men, and they're exhausting. Emily surprised herself by laughing. Short, genuine, surprised out of her. Eleanor's expression did the thing that Nate's expression did when he was pleased and didn't want to make a production of it. He got the bracelet, Emily said. Eleanor looked at her. He kept it on. For the dinner, he didn't take it off. Eleanor was quiet for a moment, and when she spoke again, her voice had something in it that she'd been keeping out of it until now. She made it for him the week before the setup, she said. She told him it was for luck. She chose the colors herself. She paused. Lily has not asked any man to come to breakfast before. I want you to know that. Emily looked at the window. The rain was heavier now, and the street outside was doing the thing wet streets did, reflecting the lights of the buildings above them back up at themselves. Everything doubled, the world and its mirror running alongside each other on the wet asphalt. She needed to get back to the bookstore. The tin ceiling was waiting. She picked up her jacket and her bag, and she stood, and Eleanor Hayes looked up at her with the composed face of a woman who had said what she came to say and would not belabor it. Thank you, Emily said, for coming. Thank you for staying to hear it, Eleanor said. Emily buttoned her jacket and went out into the rain, and she walked the 2 blocks back to the bookstore on Atlantic Avenue, and she unlocked the door and went in alone because it was too early for the crew, and she stood in the middle of the long empty space and looked up at the pressed tin ceiling she'd uncovered, and she thought about everything she'd been given in the last 2 hours, the railing under the paint. She picked up her tools and went back to work. The tin ceiling took another full week to restore properly. which was exactly the amount of time Emily needed, and which she was self-aware enough to recognize was not a coincidence. She worked the bookstore in the mornings and early afternoons, and she spent her evenings in the studio apartment with the laptop open and the Hollander building proposal pulled up, not editing it exactly, but returning to it the way you return to a problem that had been sitting in the back of your mind long enough to have developed its own momentum. She had built that proposal over 4 months of early mornings at Halcyon, and it was good work, thorough, detailed, financially considered in the way she'd learned to be after Marcus, with nothing left vague and nothing assumed. She'd never sent it to anyone because she'd never had anyone to send it to. She thought about that. She thought about it carefully, the way Eleanor Hayes had suggested, without saying, "Look at what's actually in front of you, not what you're afraid might be behind it." What was in front of her was this: a man who had built a company around exactly the kind of investment she'd spent months designing a proposal for. A man who had told her, before she knew the scale of what he could do, that he wanted to invest in overlooked community spaces, not just financially, and had then gone and engaged a professional designer to begin the actual work of it. A man whose mother had driven 40 minutes in the rain to give a stranger the context her son wouldn't claim for himself. She was not going to confuse understanding with absolution. She was clear on that. The hurt was real and the breach was real, and those things didn't disappear because she understood them better. But she had been carrying the hurt and the breach like they were the whole structure, when they were actually one damaged section of something larger. And she was beginning to believe fundamentally sound. She thought about what Lily had said about the brownstone on Remsen Street. It looks like it's been a lot of things, but it stayed. She thought about that a lot, actually, more than was probably reasonable, given that the person who'd said it was 6.5 and had been talking about a building. On the Friday of the second week, Danny and Arturo finished the floor refinishing, and Emily stood in the middle of the bookstore alone after they'd gone and looked at what the space had become. The floors were back to their original warm honey, the grain of the old wood clean and present after decades of carpet and accumulated damage. The tin ceiling ran the full length of the room, the pattern continuous and whole, the patched section she'd matched by hand, invisible unless you knew where to look and were looking for it. The bricked-over storefront window was reopened, and the late afternoon light came through it in a long rectangle that fell across the restored floor in the way the original architect had probably intended when they'd positioned the window in 1908. It was not a finished space. The shelving still needed installation, the lighting needed to be hung, the back office was in a state of organized chaos. Patrick would need a contractor for the electrical work. There was still a list, but the bones were visible again. Everything that had been covered or damaged or decided against without care. It had been found and addressed and left better than it was. And the room was honest now in a way it hadn't been when she'd walked into it the first time, and found it layered in other people's bad decisions. She stood in the late afternoon light with her hands in her pockets, and she made a decision she'd been building toward for 2 weeks without quite acknowledging it. She picked up her phone and called him. He answered on the second ring, same as always. "Emily," he said, and the way he said her name had the particular quality of someone who had been careful not to reach, and was suddenly less certain they could keep being careful. "I'm at the bookstore," she said. "On Atlantic Avenue. Can you come?" A pause. "Now?" "If you can." "I'll be there in 40 minutes, he said without any performance of deliberation. "Okay," she said. She hung up and went back to looking at the ceiling and did not spend 40 minutes doing anything she could have reported on with any accuracy. He arrived in 37 minutes, which she would not have clocked except that she had been clocking it. He was in work clothes, a dark jacket, no tie, the slightly end-of-week version of himself that she'd come to recognize as the version closest to the grain of him. He stood in the doorway of the bookstore and looked at the room the way she'd hoped he might look at it, taking it in as a whole first, and then by parts, the ceiling and the floors and the window and the light, and his expression was honest in the way his expressions were when he wasn't managing them. "You did this," he said. "Me and a small crew," she said, "but mostly me." He stepped inside and walked slowly down the length of the room, looking up at the tin ceiling, and she followed the path of his gaze and saw it again through new eyes, the way you could sometimes when a person who hadn't seen it before saw it for the first time. He stopped near the back of the room and turned to look at her. The afternoon light was lower now, coming through the storefront window at a long angle that made the floor glow. "How did you know it was here?" he asked. The tin. Drop ceilings from the 1970s, she said. Someone was always hiding something underneath them. The instinct was wrong, but the impulse wasn't terrible. They thought they were modernizing. They didn't understand that what they had was better than what they were putting over it. She paused. They never do, in the moment. You only see it when someone takes the trouble to look underneath. He held her gaze. He understood that they were not only talking about the ceiling, and he didn't pretend otherwise. Emily, he said. I talked to your mother, she said. Something shifted in his face, surprise and then something more complicated than surprise, moving through his expression in quick succession. She told me, he said, last Sunday. She called and told me she'd met with you, and I... He stopped. I was not happy about it initially. Initially, Emily said. And then she told me what she'd said, and I was... He paused again, and she could see him being careful not to use her conversation with Eleanor as a lever on the current one. I was grateful she'd said it, even though I was the one who should have said it. You should have, Emily agreed. I know. She told me about Caroline. Emily kept her voice level, not clinical, just present. The part you didn't tell me, about why the hiding felt necessary. He was quiet for a moment. That's not... He stopped. Started differently. That's not a justification. I know it's not. She was very clear about that. Emily looked at the floor for a moment and then back at him. But it's context I needed. The full picture. She paused. You have a specific fear about what your world does to people you love. And you decided, somewhere in the middle of all this, that the best way to protect me from that was to not tell me about it until... She opened one hand slightly. Until you figured out, I suppose, whether there was something worth protecting. That's not... He stopped again, and she could see him resisting the impulse to reframe it more favorably for himself. Yes, he said simply. That's exactly what I did. And I understand that by doing it, I removed your ability to make an informed decision, which is... That's not protection. That's control, even if it didn't feel that way to me at the time. Emily looked at him. She thought about the amount of people in her life who had ever said something like that, located the mechanism of their own mistake clearly, and named it without softening it first. She had been with Marcus for 3 years and could not remember a single instance. I'm still angry, she said. Okay, he said. I'm going to be angry about it for a while longer. That's not something I can turn off because I understand it better. I'm not asking you to turn it off, but I'm also... She stopped, because this was the harder part, the part that required being as honest as she'd been asking him to be. I've been hiding too, she said. Not the same way, but I came to that dinner wearing exhaustion like armor. I've been doing that for 14 months, performing being too damaged to be worth pursuing, because if I made myself small enough and tired enough and unavailable enough, then nobody could... She stopped again. Nobody could get close enough to use it against you, he said quietly. Yes. He held her gaze. The room around them was still, the light going softer as the afternoon moved. Lily called you yesterday, he said. Emily blinked. What? She picked up my phone. He had the expression of someone who had rehearsed being stern about this and not quite managed it. She knew your number was in there because she'd seen me check the phone enough times that she understood which contact I was looking at. She called, and it went to voicemail, and she left a message. He paused. I found out afterward. I didn't plan it. Emily stared at him. She had not listened to her voicemails that week because she never listened to voicemails. She pulled her phone out and put it on speaker and found the voicemail from Thursday at 4:12 in the afternoon. Lily's voice came out of the phone, very serious and slightly rushed, in the way of someone who had prepared what they wanted to say, but was also slightly aware they were doing something transgressive and wanted to complete it before being caught. Hi, Emily, it's Lily. Dad didn't ask me to call. He doesn't know. I just wanted to say that Gerald misses you on the windowsill, and I think you should come back. Also, I made a new bridge drawing, but it's not as good because I didn't have you and Dad to tell me things about it. Okay, that's all. Bye. A pause, and then quieter. Also, I picked the yellow and blue beads for Dad's bracelet because yellow is for when you're trying really hard, and blue is for when something is real. The voicemail ended. Emily stood in the middle of the bookstore with the phone in her hand and said nothing for a moment. She was aware that her throat was doing something she needed to manage, and she managed it by looking at the ceiling for a few seconds until the feeling passed enough to work with. She looked back at Nate. He was watching her with the unguarded expression, the one she'd first seen in the doorway of Lily's room, the one that had never been fully containable since, and underneath it something that had been held in careful tension for weeks. "Yellow is for when you're trying really hard," Emily said. "Apparently," he said, and his voice was not quite steady either, which was the first time she'd heard it like that. "She's 6.5, Emily said. "I know. She knew what she was doing with those colors, didn't she?" "She usually does," he said. "I've given up pretending otherwise." Emily looked at him for a long moment. She thought about fear. Hers, his, the specific kinds of fear that came from having lost things you built your life around, and how fear was a reasonable response to that, a sane one, and how it could also become the thing that prevented anything from being built again. She thought about the space between reasonable caution and permanent hiding, and about where she had been living for the past 14 months, and whether she was prepared to keep living there. She thought about what it had felt like to hold a stranger's hand on a sidewalk in Brooklyn Heights, and feel, for the first time in over a year, like she was somewhere rather than nowhere. "I'm not ready to go back to exactly where we were," she said. "I need you to understand that. I can't just—" She exhaled. "We need to do this differently. I need to be able to ask you things and have you tell me the truth even when it's uncomfortable, and I need you to stop deciding what's good for me to know. That's not negotiable." "Understood," he said, not fast, not deflecting. He took the second to let it land. "And I need it to be slow," she said. "Not because I doubt you, but because I need to trust my own judgment again. It took a significant hit, so I need to do this at a pace where I can actually see what I'm doing." "Whatever pace you need," he said. "That's not a performance of patience. I mean it." She believed him. That was the thing, the ongoing, slightly inconvenient fact of him. She believed him. "Okay," she said. "Okay," he said back, carefully, not making it more than it was. She looked at the ceiling again. "What do you think of the space?" He followed her gaze upward, letting the conversation shift because she needed it to. "I think," he said, after a moment, "that whoever covered this up in 1973 should answer for it." Emily laughed, and it was easy, the laugh, the kind that didn't require any effort on either side, that just happened because something was genuinely funny and they were genuinely in the same room together. She'd missed this. She'd been missing it since the night she'd opened the laptop and typed his name into a search bar, and the missing of it had been part of the information she'd been sitting with, even when she hadn't wanted to admit it. "Come on," she said. "I want to show you the floor." She walked him through the space the way she walked clients through finished work. Except it wasn't like that at all, because the way he looked at everything she showed him was the way she looked at buildings, with actual attention, genuine curiosity, questions that demonstrated he'd been listening to her talk about this kind of work for weeks and had retained most of it. He crouched down at the threshold between the back office and the main floor to look at the transition between two different wood species where a wall had been removed, and she explained what she'd done to make the join invisible from walking distance, and he asked 3 follow-up questions about technique. "You know," she said, "most people just look at the floor and say, 'That looks nice.'" He stood back up. "Most people haven't spent 2 months listening to you explain that every building decision is a moral position." "I don't say it like that." "You say it exactly like that," he said without any edge to it. "You're right, as far as I can tell, but you do say it like that." She looked at him. He was smiling, the full version of it, not the small managed version from the first dinner. And it did the thing to his face that it always did, the younger and less armored thing, and she stood in her restored bookstore in the late afternoon light and let herself have the feeling of it without immediately trying to put it somewhere safer. "I need to lock up," she said. "Of course." They walked out together and she locked the door, and they stood on Atlantic Avenue in the mild spring evening. May now, the trees in leaf along the street, the air having finally given up its winter residue. And the city was doing its early evening thing around them, the low percussion of rush hour fading, people moving through the neighborhood with the looser gait of the end of the workday. "Can I walk with you?" he asked. "Where?" "Wherever you're going." She looked at him. I'm going home. It's a 40-minute walk. I know, he said. I've looked at the map. She started walking. He fell into step beside her. They didn't hold hands, not yet. That came back gradually over the next few days in the same unhurried way it had arrived the first time. But they walked the 40 minutes together through the Brooklyn evening, talking the way they talked, about the bookstore and about Lily's bridge obsession, which had expanded to include suspension cables specifically, and about a building on Dean Street that Emily pointed out mid-block with the urgent need of someone who needed to share what she was seeing. And he looked at it and asked the right questions, and by the time they reached her block on West 83rd Street, she was aware of how much lighter she felt than she had in weeks. He stopped at the entrance to her building. Thank you, he said. For tonight. You walked 40 minutes out of your way, she said. 47, he said. I checked beforehand. It was worth it. She looked at him in the streetlight, this careful, complicated man with his dead wife's grief and his daughter's bead bracelet and his billions of dollars that he wore like an inconvenience. And she thought that she had been afraid of this for a long time and was still afraid of it and was choosing to be afraid of it in the direction of him rather than the direction of away. Tell Lily I got the voicemail, she said. Tell her Gerald can expect a visit soon. Something in his face went very still for a moment and then settled into something warm and real. I will, he said. Good night, Nate. Good night, Emily. She went inside. She did not look back from the door, but she stood in the vestibule for a moment with her hand on the stair rail and let herself have the full complicated feeling of it, the fear still there. Yes, and the anger not quite gone, but underneath both of those, patient and persistent, and apparently not something she was able to talk herself out of. The feeling of wanting to be somewhere and being, at least for this evening, exactly there. May moved through itself the way May did in New York. The city suddenly remembering it was alive. The trees on every block going from bare to fully green in what seemed like 3 days. The light different in the mornings, longer and less tentative. Emily noticed it in the way she noticed things in buildings. The shift in quality, the temperature of it, the way it changed what you could see. She and Nate moved carefully and honestly, which was slower than easy but better than easy in the way that things you built properly were better than things you built fast. She visited the West Village townhouse on a Sunday, and Lily received her with the ceremony of someone who had been holding a plastic giraffe in reserve, and presented it at the threshold with a gravity that made Emily press her lips together very hard. I kept him at the windowsill, Lily said, but I told him you were coming. Thank you for the warning, Emily said. I brought something. She held out the book she'd found during the week, a slim illustrated volume on the structural engineering of suspension bridges, written for general audiences, that she'd come across in a used bookstore on Court Street and known immediately was for Lily. Lily took it with both hands and looked at the cover for a long moment, and then looked at Emily with an expression that was the most purely direct thing Emily had ever seen on a human face. This is exactly what I needed, Lily said. I thought so, Emily said. Nate, behind Lily, had the doorway expression again. Emily met his eyes briefly and then went inside, because Lily was already walking toward the kitchen, explaining that she'd been working on a new pancake recipe involving brown butter and that Emily's assessment was going to be important. The pancakes were better than the first batch. Emily told her so without exaggeration, explained specifically what had improved: the texture, the lift, the ratio of butter. And Lily took notes on a small pad she had apparently designated for this purpose, which Emily found so characteristic of this child that she had to look at her orange juice glass for a moment. She takes notes on everything, Nate said across the table, in the tone of a man who had adjusted his entire sense of normal around this fact. I've noticed, Emily said. Is that bad? Lily asked, looking up from the pad. It's very good, Emily said. It's what professionals do. Lily wrote something in the pad. Emily was fairly sure she wrote, Emily says professionals take notes, and chose not to verify this. The morning was comfortable in the way their mornings had always been comfortable, and she registered that gratitude while also registering that it was not identical to how it had been before. There was something more honest in it now, less effortless because they were both choosing it more consciously, which was a different thing than effortless and, she thought, a better one. She had been suspicious of effortless things for a long time, things that required nothing could be taken away without anything lost, things that required showing up, Those had a different weight. After breakfast, Lily went to her room to read the bridge book, which she did with the focused tunnel vision of a child who had found the exact right thing, and Emily helped clear the kitchen because it felt rude not to. And she and Nate moved around each other in the domestic logistics of the space with the slight careful attention of two people who were rebuilding the ease of a thing rather than assuming it was already there. He handed her a dish towel and their hands touched briefly, and neither of them said anything about it, which was its own kind of acknowledgement. "I want to show you something," he said when the kitchen was in order. "If you have time." She had time. She followed him to the small study off the living room, a room she hadn't been in before. Bookshelves, floor to ceiling, a desk that had the organized chaos of someone who did real work at it, and on the desk a collection of folders and a large unrolled architectural drawing pinned at the corners. She stepped closer and looked at the drawing. It was preliminary, rough, conceptual, but it was a building plan, and she could read building plans the way she read everything else about architecture, quickly and completely, absorbing the intent behind the lines. "This is the Westfield Community Center," Nate said, coming to stand beside her. "It's a two-story structure in the South Bronx that's been vacant for 11 years. The foundation owns the building. The community organization that used to occupy it lost its funding, and the building's been sitting." He paused. "The Hayes Foundation acquired it 6 weeks ago. We're in the planning phase." Emily looked at the drawing. She could see what the building wanted. The space was generous, the bones were probably decent given the era of construction, and someone had done enough preliminary structural assessment to indicate which walls were original and which were added later. She could see the outline of what it had been and what it could become. "This is the foundation," she said. "Yes. Jess's project. Part of it. She's working on the interior design framework. But I need—" He stopped. "We need someone who understands buildings the way you understand buildings. Not just cosmetically, the structural vision, what these spaces were, what they can become, why it matters that they become it and not something else." Emily looked at the drawing. She was quiet for a long enough moment that he didn't fill the silence, which was his way, and she was grateful for it because she needed the silence to hear herself think. "You're offering me a job," she said. "I'm offering you a project. Several projects, eventually. The foundation has identified 8 buildings in the first phase." He was careful, she noticed, not to lead with the financial terms, not to make it about scale or compensation before she'd had the chance to respond to the work itself. "But I want you to know, and I need you to believe this, that I'm not doing this to fix what happened between us. I'm not offering you this because I owe you something or because I think it will—" He stopped. "This is the right person for the work. That's true independent of everything else. I've known it since the night you described the Hollander building." She looked at the drawing again. She thought about the 4 months she'd spent building a proposal that she'd never had anyone to send to. She thought about the Hollander building, its terrazzo floors and painted-over railings, and the first time she'd walked into that lobby and felt it like a physical thing, the wrongness of what had been done to it and the rightness of what was still underneath. She thought about 8 buildings in the first phase. "I need to review the scope properly," she said. "And I need to negotiate the terms myself, not through you. I need it to be a real professional engagement, not something that lives in the personal space." "Of course," he said immediately. "And I need to be able to tell you when the architectural vision and the financial vision are in conflict and have that conversation without it becoming about us." "Yes. And if that becomes impossible to separate—" She turned to look at him directly. "Then the work has to come first. The buildings have to come first. That has to be the agreement." He met her gaze steadily. "I designed this foundation around exactly that principle," he said. "The buildings come first. That's why I need someone like you on it." She looked at him for another moment. She thought about the day in Astoria when she'd been pulling subfloor boards in Gerald's brownstone, and about the Hollander building folder on her laptop that she never opened, and about the year and 3 months she'd spent shrinking her professional life down to survival scale because she'd lost everything to someone who hadn't deserved any of it. She thought about stopped being small enough to disappear. "Send me the full project brief," she said. "I'll review it and come back to you with questions." Something in his face moved. Relief, she thought, and something quieter than relief, something that had been waiting for longer than the current conversation. "Thank you," he said. "Don't thank me yet," she said. "I'm going to have a lot of questions." "I'm counting on it," he said. Net. The Hollander building proposal had been sitting in a folder on her laptop for 4 months when she finally opened it again on a Tuesday evening in the third week of May, spread it out on the kitchen table with a cup of coffee and her red pen, and read through it from the beginning with the eye of someone seeing it fresh. It was good. Better than she'd remembered. She'd been inside it for so long that she'd lost perspective, but reading it now with the distance of several months, she could see it clearly. The research was thorough, the cost modeling was realistic, the architectural vision was specific without being rigid. She'd written a section on why the building's history mattered to its future that she read twice and thought, yes, that's the argument. That's the actual argument. She made notes in the margins. She updated the cost estimates based on what she'd learned in the past 4 months of project work. She added a section she hadn't had the first time about the community context, the neighborhood, the specific population the building had served, and what its vacancy had cost. She worked until midnight and went to bed and lay awake for 40 minutes, not with the anxious sleeplessness she'd been carrying for months, but with the different kind, the productive kind, where your mind was running because it was working, because there was something to work on. She sent the updated proposal to Nate the next morning with a note. This is a building I've been thinking about for a long time. I'm not asking you to fund it because we know each other. I'm asking you to read it because it's the right project, and this is what the foundation is for. His response came 90 minutes later. I've read it. I've also sent it to our acquisitions team. Can you meet Thursday? She stared at the screen. Thursday works, she wrote back, and had to put the phone down and walk a lap of her apartment before she could sit still again. She stood at the kitchen window and looked at the brick wall opposite, where the photograph of the Brooklyn Bridge had once been taped before it faded and fell. The window was just a window now, the wall just a wall. Plenty of light came through anyway. She hadn't needed the photograph for a long time. She was 40 minutes into the grand opening event for the Atlantic Avenue bookstore. Patrick had strung Edison lights across the ceiling, the shelving was full, the restored space doing everything she'd known it could do when she'd first looked up at that hidden tin ceiling in early April, when she understood clearly that she didn't want to be there, not because the space wasn't beautiful. It was. She could see it in the faces of the people moving through it, the way they tilted their heads back to look at the ceiling and smiled without realizing they were doing it. She could see it in Patrick's face when he shook her hand at the door and said, I didn't know it could look like this, and meant it in the specific way people meant things when the reality exceeded what they'd imagined. She had done good work here. She was proud of it in the real way, not the performed way, the quiet, solid satisfaction of a problem solved properly. But she was thinking about the West Village, about a man opening a door, about a child with a bridge drawing and a small plastic giraffe. She had been thinking about it for 3 hours, since she'd gotten ready in her apartment and chosen, without entirely deciding to choose, the dress she'd bought 2 weeks ago at a second-hand shop on Atlantic Avenue, a dark blue one, not the one Jess had mentioned months ago since that one was gone, but a blue dress nonetheless. And she had stood in front of her small mirror and thought, blue is for when something is real, and put it on. She stayed through the speeches and through the first glass of wine and through the moment when a woman she didn't know came and told her that the floor looked like it had always been there, which was the right thing to say and made her throat do the dangerous thing briefly. And then she set her glass down on a shelf and found Patrick and congratulated him and thanked his contractor and got her jacket. She walked out onto Atlantic Avenue into the warm May evening and stood for a moment in the still present light of 7:15, and she thought about where she was going and whether she was certain. And she was certain. She walked to the subway. She came up from the West Village station into the spring dark, the neighborhood warm and lit in its Friday evening way, and she walked to the tree-lined block and stood in front of the limestone townhouse and looked up at the lit windows on the 3rd floor, where she could see the moving shadows of the evening inside. And she thought about all of it, the fear, the anger, the long, careful approach to this, and she thought, enough. Enough of the careful approach. She'd been careful long enough. She pressed the buzzer. The intercom crackled. Who is it? Lily's voice, alert and interested. It's Emily. A pause, about 2 seconds, the length of time it took a 6.5-year-old to fully process good information. Then, Dad. Emily is at the door in a blue dress. The buzzer sounded. Emily pushed the door open and went up the stairs, and Nate was coming down them, which meant he'd been heading to the buzzer before Lily had gotten there first. and they met in the middle of the staircase with slightly undignified coordination, him 3 steps above her, the narrow stairwell suddenly feeling considerably smaller. He looked at her. She looked at him. The blue dress. His bare feet again, the end of Friday version of him. A book in one hand that he was still holding, which meant she'd interrupted something, which meant she was here and it was real, and she hadn't called first. "Hi," she said. "Hi," he said. "I left the opening early." "I know," he said. I had planned to text, but I didn't want to." "I know," she said. "Dad? Why are you standing on the stairs?" Lily called from above. Neither of them looked up. "I'm not ready to have everything figured out," Emily said. "I want to be clear about that. I have a lot of fears, and some of them are going to make me difficult, and I can't promise I won't sometimes lead with the wrong one." "I know," he said. "I'm not asking for figured out. I've never been figured out in my life. I'm going to need you to be honest with me even when you're afraid the honesty will cost you something." "Yes," he said. "I understand that. I'll do that. And I'm going to need—" She stopped because Lily appeared at the top of the stairs, in her pajamas, holding Gerald the plastic giraffe at arm's length in the direction of Emily. "Gerald would like to be closer to the conversation," Lily announced with full seriousness. Emily looked at the giraffe. She looked at Nate, who had his eyes slightly closed in the manner of a man exercising profound parental patience. She looked back at Lily. "Could Gerald wait 5 minutes?" Emily asked. Lily considered this. 3, she said. "Deal," Emily said. Lily retreated. Nate opened his eyes. The silence in the stairwell had the particular quality of something about to change. "I'm scared," Emily said. "So am I," he said. "Okay," she said. "Good. I think that's actually the honest version of this." "I think you're right," he said. She climbed the 2 steps that were between them. He didn't move to meet her, which was right. He'd been waiting long enough. She was the one who'd come to the door. This was hers to do. And she looked at him at close range, this tired good man with the gray at his temples and the book still in his hand and the bead bracelet on his wrist, yellow and blue. And she put her hand against his jaw the way you touch something you'd been trying not to break and had finally decided to trust yourself with. He covered her hand with his, the book dropping to the stair with a soft thump neither of them addressed. She kissed him. Not dramatically. Nothing about them was dramatic in that way, but fully and without reservation, the way you did something you'd stop talking yourself out of. And he kissed her back with the same quality, careful and present and nothing withheld. "1 minute," Lily announced from the top of the stairs. Emily pulled back slightly and laughed against his mouth, and he laughed too, quietly, and for a moment they stood on the staircase with their foreheads nearly touching, both of them trying to compose themselves, which was not particularly dignified and was also the most real Emily had felt in the longest time she could currently account for. "We should probably go up," she said. "We should," he agreed. She picked up his book from the stair and handed it to him. He took her other hand and they went up together, and Lily was at the top waiting with Gerald the giraffe, and the expression of someone who had successfully managed a complex situation to its correct outcome and was prepared to receive appropriate acknowledgement. Emily accepted Gerald. She looked at the small plastic giraffe and then at the child who had assigned him to her care twice now, and she thought about yellow beads for trying really hard, and blue beads for when something is real. "Thank you for keeping him," Emily said. Lily nodded with great dignity. "He's been ready," she said. The 3 of them went into the apartment, and the door closed behind them, and outside on the West Village street the Friday evening went on doing what it was doing, full of its ordinary business, indifferent to the specific gravity of what was happening on the other side of that door. Which was fine. The best things usually happened that way, quietly, privately, in spaces that didn't ask to be noticed. Emily knew that better than most people. She had spent a year learning to see what was real underneath the surface of things. She was still learning. The Thursday meeting about the Hollander building ran 2 hours and 40 minutes, which was 40 minutes longer than scheduled, and Emily didn't apologize for any of it. She had come prepared in a way she hadn't been prepared for anything in over a year. Not just the proposal, which she knew cold, but the research behind it, the cost modeling, the structural assessment she'd done during 3 separate visits to the building over the past week. Two of them at 7 in the morning before the property management company's office opened. She had a binder. She had photographs. She had a hand-drawn site analysis that she'd done at Halcyon across 4 separate mornings. The pages slightly coffee-ringed at the corners, which she did not hide because they were accurate, and accuracy was the point. The Hayes Foundation board had 3 people in the room besides Nate. A woman named Patricia, who ran operations and had the efficient manner of someone who had seen many proposals and wasted no time on bad ones. A structural engineer named Warren, who reviewed the technical components with his chin in his hand and asked questions that were specific enough to signal genuine expertise, and a younger man named David who handled community relations and wanted to know about the neighborhood impact modeling. Emily answered every question. She pushed back once on Patricia, who suggested the timeline was ambitious, with specific evidence from comparable restorations she'd worked on and researched. Patricia considered this and revised her position, which Emily noted was the mark of someone who actually cared about getting it right rather than being right. Nate sat at the far end of the table and said very little, which was deliberate and which she appreciated. This was her project, her argument, her professional space, and he understood that without being told. He asked one question, near the end, about the community engagement strategy, and it was a good question, the kind that built on everything she'd said rather than redirecting it. When it was over and Patricia had said they'd be in touch within 2 weeks, and Warren had shaken her hand with the particular respect of one technical person for another, Nate walked her to the elevator and they stood waiting for it in the corridor of an office building that was, she now understood, his office building, on a floor that bore his company's name in the lobby, surrounded by people who knew who he was and conducted themselves accordingly. She had been in this world for 40 minutes, and she had not once felt like a different version of herself. "You were excellent," he said simply. "I know the building," she said. "You know more than the building." He said it the way he said things he meant without ornament. "You know why the building matters." "That's rarer." The elevator arrived. She stepped in and turned back to look at him standing in the corridor in his actual world, which was large and polished and nothing like the warm informality of a West Village kitchen on a Sunday morning. And she thought about what Eleanor had told her, that he was afraid of what his world did to people he loved. And she thought that his fear was understandable, and also, she was beginning to believe, not the whole truth. "I'll wait to hear from Patricia," she said. "You'll hear from her Monday," he said. "She makes fast decisions when the work is clear." The elevator doors started to close. Emily put her hand out and stopped them. "You knew it was clear before I came in," she said. "Yes," he said. "You still let me make the full argument." "It was yours to make," he said. "Not mine." She looked at him for another moment, this careful man who kept getting it right in the ways that actually mattered. Then she let the elevator doors close and rode down 22 floors, and she stood in the lobby of the Hayes Capitol building on Park Avenue with her binder and her coffee-ringed site analysis and her worn leather bag, and she felt, in a specific and unfamiliar way, like someone who was back. Not back to who she'd been before Marcus. That person had been good but incomplete in ways she couldn't fully see until she'd lost everything and had to figure out from first principles what she was actually made of. This was something different. This was the version that knew the cost of things and had paid it and had come out on the other side, still able to stand in a room and argue for the things she believed in. She went back to Brooklyn on the subway and spent the afternoon at the Hollander building, walking around its exterior one more time, and she looked up at its facade. The limestone darkened with decades of weather, the original ironwork at the entry, the proportions of the windows that gave away what it had been when someone built it to matter. And she said, quietly to the building in the way she sometimes talked to buildings when no one was around, "Not much longer." The building said nothing back, because buildings didn't, and Emily was a sane person who understood this, and she put her hands in her pockets and walked home. Patricia called on Monday, as Nate had said she would, and the terms were real and fair in a way that required no negotiation on the points that mattered, only clarification on scope and timeline, and Emily hung up the phone and sat at her kitchen table for a moment, with the particular feeling of something long held finally being set down. She called Jess. "The Hollander building," she said when Jess answered. A pause. "Emily, the foundation acquired it. I'm the restoration architect. It's a real contract, Jess. The terms are, it's real." She could hear Jess processing this, and then the sound of Jess pressing her hand over the phone and saying something to someone in her office, muffled but clearly emotional in register. And then, I knew. I knew from the night you showed me those photographs a year ago that this building was yours. I knew it. You never told me that. You weren't ready to hear it then, Jess said simply. You are, now. Emily looked at the kitchen window where the brick wall of the neighboring building was doing its brick wall thing, ordinary and present and real. I'm going to need a designer on the commercial spaces, she said, when we get there. Obviously, Jess said. Obviously it's going to be me. Was there any question? No, Emily admitted. I just wanted to make it official. Consider it official. A pause. How's Lily? Emily thought about the previous Sunday when Lily had informed her that Gerald the giraffe needed a friend and had presented this argument with a detailed supporting case that included a ranked list of candidate animals and the specific criteria by which she had ranked them, written in her small, careful handwriting in the notes pad she used for pancake assessments, and apparently also for giraffe procurement decisions. She gave me a procurement list, Emily said, for a companion animal for Gerald. It has 6 items on it with ratings. She's 7 in September, Jess said. She's going to run the world. Nate already knows this, Emily said. He has accepted it. She could hear Jess smiling. You sound different, Jess said. Different how? Like yourself, Jess said. Like the version of you I haven't heard in a year and a half. Emily was quiet for a moment. She looked at the window, at the ordinary wall, at the light coming through the glass and landing on the kitchen floor, in the irregular way light did when it had to navigate around obstacles. It was fine light. It was perfectly good light. I'll call you Thursday about the Hollander scope, she said. Emily. What? I'm glad, Jess said, not performing it, not delivering it with any additional architecture, just the plain fact of it. Yeah, Emily said. Me too. The Hollander building acquisition was finalized in early June, which meant the demolition permits and the structural assessment and the first real site walk with her full crew took place in the specific golden light of early summer. The city in its most cooperative mood, the long evenings hanging around like they didn't want to leave. Warren, the foundation's structural engineer, did the first site walk with her, and she liked him in the professional way you liked someone whose work you trusted. He was thorough and unromanticized about the problems, which were real and various, and he didn't overstate any of them, which was rarer than it should have been. The foundation was sound. The floors needed work. The lobby's terrazzo, which she had thought about for 2 years, was intact under a layer of poured concrete overlay that somebody had applied in 1988, probably over a weekend, probably at significant cost that had accomplished nothing except concealment. She stood in the lobby with Warren and the concrete overlay under her feet, and thought about all the times she had looked at this floor from the outside, imagining it, and how it was going to feel to uncover it for real. The overlay will take 2 days to remove carefully, Warren said. Maybe 3, depending on adhesion. 3, Emily said. We do it carefully. Agreed, he said. She brought Nate to the building that weekend on a Saturday morning, just the 2 of them. Not a professional visit, not a meeting, just her wanting to show him the thing she was most excited about, and knowing he would understand why she was excited about it. They stood in the lobby, and she explained everything. The terrazzo composition, the original color palette she'd identified from archival photographs, the way the pattern extended from the lobby through the corridor to the elevator bank, and how she was going to restore the continuity of it. He listened the way he always listened, and when she finished, he was quiet for a moment looking at the gray concrete underfoot. You've been thinking about this floor for 2 years, he said. 26 months, she said, since the first time I walked in here. And now you're going to uncover it. In about 3 weeks, yes. He looked up from the floor to her face, and the expression on his face was one she'd been collecting over the past months without meaning to, the ones that told her something about the actual quality of the man behind the careful exterior. This one was simple. It was just happiness for her. Uncomplicated, unperformed, his own. I want to be here when you do, he said. I was going to ask you, she said. He took her hand and they walked through the building together, all 6 floors, and she told him what was going to happen in every room. And he asked questions that were about understanding and not about demonstrating understanding, which was the difference between actual curiosity and performance. And by the time they came back down to the lobby and stood in the gray light of the June morning, she had talked herself into a state of creative aliveness that she hadn't felt in the years she'd spent building her practice, and had apparently never fully lost even under 14 months of survival mode. "Thank you," she said. "For what?" "For asking the right questions," she said. "For being someone I can think out loud at." "Thank you for thinking out loud at me," he said. "I've been doing the same since I met you. I've just been less obvious about it." She looked at him. "You've been thinking out loud at me?" "Constantly," he said. "You make things make sense. Things I've been thinking about for years that didn't have the right shape." He paused. "The foundation. The kind of work I actually wanted to do with everything I'd built. I'd had the idea, but you gave it not permission, that's the wrong word. You gave it clarity, like—" He stopped. "Like pulling up the concrete overlay," she said. "Yes," he said. "Exactly like that." She looked at the gray floor beneath them, at the potential of it, at the thing she knew was waiting underneath. She thought about the past 2.5 years of her life. The practice and Marcus and the collapse and the survival and the small coffee shop with its 7 tables and Rosa who knew her order and the blind date she'd gone to dressed in armor and the man who'd been waiting by the window with a child's bracelet on his wrist. She thought about this particular design of arriving somewhere you didn't plan to go and finding out it was exactly where you needed to be. She was not a romantic in the way people use that word to mean someone who believed things were meant to happen. She was an architect. She believed in structural integrity and honest materials and the patience required to uncover what was actually there rather than what you wished for. She believed that most things, if you were willing to do the work, could be made into what they were always supposed to be. She believed that. She had believed it about buildings for her entire professional life. She was learning to believe it about the rest of things, too. The wedding was in October on a Saturday when the light in New York had taken on the amber quality it got in fall, that particular warm slant that made everything look like it was being remembered rather than lived. They had chosen a theater, the Mercer Theater in Lower Manhattan, a 1920s building that had been on a slow slide into disrepair for a decade before a community arts organization had acquired it 3 years earlier and begun the process of restoration. The work wasn't complete. There were still sections of the upper balcony that were cordoned off, still areas where the original plasterwork was in progress, still evidence everywhere of a building mid-recovery. Emily had specifically wanted that. Nate had understood without explanation. The guest list was not what anyone would have predicted from the outside if the outside was looking at a billionaire's wedding and making assumptions about what that looked like. There were clients she'd worked for over the past 1.5 years. Gerald in his fleece vest, visibly moved in the way nervous men were when they let themselves be, and Donna from the brownstone in Astoria who had brought her daughter and cried from the moment she sat down. There were Arturo and Danny from the crew, in good jackets, slightly stiff in the formal setting, but present with the uncomplicated warmth of people who liked her and were glad for her. There were community members from the Hollander Buildings block who had been involved in the restoration process from the first community meeting Emily had run 6 months ago. An older woman named Mrs. Pettigrew, who had lived across the street for 40 years and had cried when they'd uncovered the terrazzo floor. A man named Robert, who had grown up using the building and whose children now used the community space that was taking shape on its ground floor. There were Nate's people, the foundation board, a handful of colleagues who had become real rather than professional presences over the months, Warren, the structural engineer who had brought his wife and appeared genuinely pleased to be there, and Eleanor Hayes in the 3rd row, in a good dress, with the composed expression of a woman who had driven 40 minutes into the city on a rainy Saturday in April on a gamble and had been proven right. There was Jess, who had been the first person Emily had called on the morning after she and Nate had made their decision official, and who had arrived at the apartment with coffee and pastries from the good place on Lexington and said, I know, before Emily had said a word, and who was now seated in the front row in a dress she had spent 3 weeks selecting and wearing it with the manner of someone who understood that this was both her best friend's wedding and also, in a real sense, partially her accomplishment. And there was Lily, 7 years old now, in a dress she had chosen herself. Green, because she said blue was already for other things, and green was for new things. Standing at the front of the theater next to her father with the solemnity of someone who had been assigned the most important role and was conducting herself accordingly. She was holding Gerald, Emily, standing in the small room off the lobby where she'd spent the 20 minutes before the ceremony doing the specific thing she'd been doing for the past hour, which was breathing in a controlled and deliberate manner, had noticed this when she'd done her final check of the theater through the doorway. She had thought, of course she is. Of course Gerald is here. She had told herself she was not going to cry before she walked down the aisle, and she had already revised this target twice in the past 20 minutes, and she was currently operating on the reduced ambition of not crying before she reached the front of the room. Jess appeared in the doorway. She looked at Emily for a moment. "Okay," she said. "Yes," Emily said. "I'm good. You look—" Jess stopped, and the thing that crossed her face was not the polished, considered expression she brought to most things. It was just love, the plain version of it, between two people who had been in each other's lives for 12 years and survived a lot of the same winters. "You look like yourself," she said. "The full version." Emily pressed her lips together firmly. "I said I wasn't going to do this before I got to the front." "You're not doing it," Jess said. "Your eyes are fine. Take a breath." Emily took a breath. "He's a wreck up there," Jess said conspiratorially. "Very contained wreck. You can see it in his hands." "He's doing the cup thing," Emily said. "The cup thing?" "He turns things in his hands when he's thinking." She paused. "He's not holding anything, which means he's doing it without the cup." Jess looked at her with an expression that was trying not to be charmed and failing. "You know him," she said. "Yeah," Emily said. "I do." Jess straightened Emily's dress at the shoulder, a small adjustment, barely necessary, more about the gesture than the correction, and stepped back. "Ready?" Emily looked at the doorway, at the theater beyond it, at the amber light coming through the restored windows of the 1920s building, where the plasterwork was still in progress, and the upper balcony was still cordoned off, and everything was still mid-recovery and beautiful anyway. "Yes," she said. Said. She walked down the aisle alone, which had been her decision, and which Nate had understood, and which Jess had initially pushed back on, before conceding that, yes, this was exactly right for Emily, to choose herself into this rather than be given away from it. The music was quiet. A string quartet playing something she'd chosen because it moved forward without rushing, which was the quality she'd needed from the music of this moment. She saw Nate before he saw her, which gave her a second to just look at him. He was in a dark suit, no tie, which she'd requested because she'd wanted him as close to himself as possible and herself as close to herself as possible. And he was standing very still except for his hands, which were doing the thing Jess had described, turning slightly without anything in them, the version of the gesture she'd only seen in its most stripped-down form. Then he saw her. The thing that happened to his face was private in the way the most real things were private, even in a room full of people. She'd seen his expressions across a spectrum now, the managed composure and the unguarded versions, and the ones that got past his usual architecture without permission. But this was something she hadn't seen before, and it took her a moment to understand what it was. It was relief. Not the relief of a narrow escape or a problem solved, but the deeper kind. The kind that came from something you had been holding at distance for a long time, finally being allowed to be close. He looked like a man who had been careful for years, and could now, in this room, in front of these people, stop being quite so careful. She reached the front of the room, and he took her hand, and she could feel that his hand was not entirely steady, which was the most honest thing she'd ever felt from him. "Hi," she said, quietly, just to him. "Hi," he said back. Lily, beside him, was watching them with her enormous, serious attention, Gerald the giraffe held formally against her green dress. She caught Emily's eye and gave a single nod of grave endorsement, which Emily received with the full solemnity it deserved. The officiant, a city clerk who turned out to have a genuinely good instinct for a room, kept the ceremony simple and true, and the words they'd written for each other were not perfect words, which Emily had insisted on. She had refused 3 drafts because they were too polished, too figured out, too much like statements and not enough like actual people talking. What she said, when it was her turn, was approximately this: "I came to a dinner planning to disappear into it. I had practiced being unlovable for months and I thought I was getting good at it. And then you listened to me talk about a building for 8 minutes without checking your phone once, and I thought, I might be in trouble." She paused, and she heard the sound of the room. Donna from the Astoria brownstone already going, and Gerald clearing his throat, and somewhere in the middle rows the sound of Danny from the crew saying something low to Arturo, probably telling him to cut it out, because Danny was stoic in most situations. I need you to know that I still have the fear, the old kind. I'm going to wake up some mornings and lead with the wrong one, and I'm asking you to let me work that out, and to tell me when I'm seeing something that isn't there. In exchange, I will do the same for you. I will see what's actually there. I have gotten very good at that. She looked at him. And what is actually there, in you, in Lily, in what we've built in the past months, is the truest thing I have found in a very long time. She had not made it to the front of the room without crying, in the end. She had conceded this target 4 steps in. He didn't do much better. He held it through most of his words, which were careful and real in the way his words always were when he let them be. But when he got to the part about Lily, about being a father who had been trying to give his daughter a whole life and not being entirely sure he was managing it, and about watching his daughter choose Emily from the first Saturday morning and understanding that Lily, as usual, had seen something clearly before he had let himself, he stopped for a moment, and the pause was not composed. She handed you Gerald, he said, which was not what he'd written, which was better than what he'd written. On the first visit, and I thought, well, that's it then. She's already decided. I'd better catch up. Lily, at this, pressed her lips together very hard in the way of someone trying to maintain dignity and finding it difficult. The room laughed, the kind of laugh that had real feeling underneath it, and Lily stood up straighter in her green dress and held Gerald with increased gravity, and Emily reached over and squeezed her hand once, briefly, and Lily squeezed back. The reception was in the theater's main hall, where the restoration had progressed furthest, the original proscenium arch visible and lit, the plasterwork on the walls documented and partially restored, the floor refinished and the chandelier rewired and rehung. It was not a finished room, and it was not trying to be. The caterers had strung warm Edison lights across the ceiling at Emily's request, and the tables were mismatched in the way she'd wanted. She'd sourced them from 3 different estate sales, different woods, and different heights and different histories, and they looked exactly right in the way that things looked right when they were honest about what they were. Eleanor Hayes, who was not a woman given to excessive display, found Emily early in the reception and took both her hands briefly and said, "I was right about you," which was not a sentimental thing to say, and was also the most Eleanor thing she could have said, and Emily understood it was the fullest version of welcome the woman was built to offer and received it accordingly. "You drove 40 minutes on a rainy Saturday," Emily said. "I would have driven further," Eleanor said. "Don't tell Nathaniel." "He already knows," Emily said. "He finds it mortifying and also, I think, entirely right." Eleanor's expression did the thing his expression did. "He is too much like his father for his own comfort sometimes," she said, and let go of Emily's hands and went to find her seat, with the self-contained composure of a woman who had said exactly what she'd come to say. Jess found her an hour into the reception, when the dancing had started and the room had reached the particular pitch of a party that had let itself go from event to actual gathering, people moving between tables, the volume up, the formality dissolved. "I need you to know," Jess said, with a glass of wine and the expression of someone about to say something they'd been holding for a while, "that setting you up with that man is the single best thing I have ever done in my professional and personal life, and I intend to take full credit forever." "You take full credit," Emily said. "I mean that. I know you do." Jess looked around the room, at Gerald in his fleece vest now dancing, improbably and with absolute commitment, with Donna from the Astoria brownstone, at Warren, the structural engineer, telling someone at length about the Mercer Theater's original plasterwork, at Arturo and Danny at the bar clearly having the best time of anyone, at Mrs. Pettigrew from the Hollander Buildings block talking to Robert, who had grown up using it, both of them animated in the way of people discovering a shared love for the same thing. "Emily," she said. "What?" "Look at your wedding." Emily looked. She took the room in fully. The mismatched tables and the Edison lights and the unfinished plasterwork and the people who had come from every different coordinate of her life over the past 2 years. Not polished, not the version of a wedding that looked like a wedding from a magazine. The version that looked like the actual life you had actually built with the actual people in it. She thought about the coffee shop with 7 tables and the photograph of the Brooklyn Bridge fading on the kitchen window. She thought about Gerald, the flooring subcontractor, and his $20 skim, and the way she'd needed the money too much to say anything. She thought about the blind date she'd gone to planning to be invisible, and the man sitting by the window with his daughter's bracelet on his wrist, already still and already present, and already, she understood now, hoping for the same thing she'd been pretending she didn't want. "Look at your wedding," Jess said again, quietly. Emily looked. The room was warm and real, and nothing about it was perfect, and she would not have changed a single detail. "Yeah," she said. "Okay." Jess put her arm around her shoulder for a moment, brief, uncharacteristic of her, and therefore more than it would have been from someone else, and then withdrew it and went back to her wine, because that was the full measure of what Jess was built to do with tenderness, which was exactly the right amount. Later, much later, past midnight, when the room had thinned and the caterers were beginning the quiet work of putting things away, and the lights had been turned down to the low, warm register of a party winding honestly rather than abruptly, Emily found Lily asleep on a chair in the corner of the room, Gerald still in one hand and her green dress slightly rumpled from the dancing she had done earlier with the same total physical commitment she brought to pancakes and bridge drawings and procurement lists. Nate was standing near the chair, his jacket off, watching Lily sleep with the expression she'd seen on him 100 times in the months she'd known him, the one that was the most undefended version of him, that he didn't try to manage or contain, the love that was the entire architecture of him underneath everything else. He looked up when Emily came to stand beside him, and she looked at Lily and then at him, and she didn't need to say anything, and neither did he for a while. "She danced for 45 minutes, he said, eventually. "I know, I counted. She told Mrs. Pettigrew all about the Hollander building, in considerable technical detail." "Mrs. Pettigrew looked interested," Emily said. "She knows things about that block that aren't in any of our documentation. I think Lily may have accidentally conducted a primary source interview." Emily looked at Lily, sleeping with the complete unself-consciousness of a child who had spent everything she had and was now replenishing it, Gerald tucked under her chin like a person, the green dress she'd chosen because green was for new things creased across the skirt from an evening of full-bodied living. "She's going to be terrifying," Emily said. "She already is," he said. I've been terrified for years." Emily leaned into him slightly, her shoulder against his arm, and he put his arm around her in the easy way of something they'd already been doing long enough to not require arrangement. The room was quiet around them, the last of the guests saying their goodbyes near the door, the caterers moving in the calm, practiced way of their work. The theater's proscenium arch was lit above the stage, the unfinished plasterwork on the walls casting its honest shadows, the chandelier doing the warm work of enough light. This was what it actually looked like, Emily thought, not the thing she'd believed love was supposed to be before Marcus took that version apart, not the performance of a life, not any of the glossed and managed presentations she'd been handed and had handed back to the world for a year and a half. It looked like a room with mismatched tables and work still to be done on the walls, and a sleeping 7-year-old with a plastic giraffe, and a man with gray at his temples and his jacket over a chair, and both of them standing in the remains of their own wedding night, quiet and tired in the right way, and not pretending to be anything else. She had been looking, she understood now, for the wrong thing for a long time. She'd been looking for a life that held together, for stability, for safety, for the absence of cracks. She had been afraid that anything with cracks would eventually fall. What she hadn't understood, or had understood intellectually, but not yet in the bone-deep way of someone who had learned it from actual experience, was that the cracks were not the problem. The cracks were evidence of the structure having been alive long enough to encounter the real world. What mattered was the foundation. What mattered was the material. Whether it was honest, whether it was what it claimed to be, whether the people who built it had cared about doing it right. She had spent the last 2 years learning to see that difference. In buildings first, and then in the harder architecture of herself. "Can I tell you something?" she said. "Always," he said. "I don't think the life I lost was the life I was supposed to be building," she said. "I think I was building it in the wrong direction. The practice, the plan, all of it. It was mine. I worked for it. I believed in it. But it was also, I was doing it the way Marcus wanted it done. The clients he wanted. The scale he was interested in. The version of success that looked like his version of success." She paused. "I think losing it was terrible." And I think it was also the most clarifying thing that ever happened to me. He was quiet, listening. I think Lily's right, she said, about buildings and about most things. Some things look like they've been a lot of things. She looked around the room. The theater, mid-recovery, the unfinished walls, the chandelier rewired and rehung, all of it in the specific honesty of a structure learning to be itself again. But they stay, and staying is the thing that actually matters. He turned to look at her, and the expression on his face was the unguarded one, the doorway one, the one she'd been collecting since the first time she'd seen it in the entrance of Lily's room 7 months ago. It had not diminished with familiarity. If anything, it had become more itself over time, more visible, less contained, because he was less contained now, in general, in the ways that mattered. She had watched it happen the way you watched a building that someone had finally stopped apologizing for and just let be what it was. I stayed, he said, for the record. I know, she said, even when you were very clearly trying to make that difficult. I was doing you a favor, she said. I was being honest about what I was. You were being honest about what you were afraid you were, he said gently. It's not the same thing. She held that for a moment. It was the kind of thing that would have stung from the wrong person or in the wrong tone, and instead landed simply as true, which was the particular quality he had that she'd never quite been able to name until now. He told you the real thing without using it as a weapon. She had met very few people in her life who could do that. Fair, she said. Lily stirred in the chair, made a small sound, resettled. They both watched her for a moment, the way you watched a sleeping child, with the particular attention of people who understood this kind of quiet didn't last and were not going to waste it. I want to be here for the terrifying part, Emily said, when she's running things. You'll be there for all of it, he said. It wasn't a question. Yeah, she said. I will. She looked at the room one more time, her actual life, in all its honest, unfinished state, and she thought about the woman who had come into a coffee shop at 5 a.m. for 7 months to practice being invisible, who had worn exhaustion like armor and walked into a blind date planning to be rejected and had somehow, against every preparation, been seen instead. She thought about how afraid she had been for so long, how much she had managed and maintained and kept at arm's length, how the distance she'd created to protect herself had also been making her a little smaller, month by month, and she hadn't wanted to see it because seeing it would have required doing something about it. The doing something about it had been the hard part. Not the dramatic gestures, the pressing buzzers and the kissing on staircases and the showing up. Those had been the easy part, in the end, the part that came naturally once she'd gotten there. The hard part had been the long interior work of deciding, slowly and without any guarantee, that she was still worth the risk of being known. She had decided. She was still deciding, probably. She thought it might be the kind of decision you made ongoing, not once, because the fear didn't disappear. It just became something you knew how to carry while you moved. But she was carrying it in the right direction now. She was clear on that. Nate picked up Lily with the practiced ease of someone who had done this 1,000 times, and Lily stirred enough to say Gerald without opening her eyes. And Emily picked up Gerald from the chair and tucked him under Lily's arm, and the three of them moved toward the door of the theater into the October night where their car was waiting and the city was doing its permanent, indifferent, magnificent thing. The theater stood behind them as they went, mid-recovery and not pretending to be otherwise. The chandelier still lit, the Edison lights strung across the high ceiling catching the last of the warmth from an evening full of people who had come to be in the same room and had succeeded. The plasterwork unfinished on the walls, the balcony still cordoned, the original floor under their feet as they left, refinished and honest and asking for nothing except to be seen. Outside, the street was dark and cool. The city moved around them with its usual absolute disinterest in any one particular life, which was, Emily had always thought, one of its most honest and most merciful qualities. Nobody here was precious. Nobody here was catastrophic. You were just one more person in a city full of them, carrying your particular version of things, taking the next step and the one after that. She took the next step. Lily's head was on Nate's shoulder and Gerald was under her arm, and the October air was clean and cold and the lights of lower Manhattan were doing what they did, which was mostly just being present and excessive and entirely themselves. Emily Carter, 31 years old, restoration architect, walked out of a theater into the night with her family, and the thing she carried in her chest was not the absence of fear. It was the presence of something she had almost talked herself out of wanting. She held on to it with both hands. The Hollander building opened to the public the following spring. The terrazzo floors, fully restored, were the first thing people noticed when they walked through the door. A small bronze plaque near the entrance read, "Restored 2024. Original construction 1923. It took 100 years for this building to become what it was always supposed to be." Some things take the time they take. Emily had written the plaque text herself. Nate had read it once, looked at her, and said, "That's the whole story." She thought he was right.